Hey, welcome back. I'm genuinely glad you're here tonight. If this is your first time finding this little corner of the internet, pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket you've had long enough that it's gone soft, and if you've been here before, well, you already know what to do. Dim the lights if you can, let the room settle into that particular quality of quiet that only arrives late in the night. We're going to be here a while, and I want you to actually feel this one. Before we go anywhere, if something about tonight's story moves you or surprises you or makes you think, it would mean a great deal to me if you left a like, maybe a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely read those. There's something I find quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in a back bedroom in Ohio, and someone in a flat in the north of England, and someone tucked under 3 blankets somewhere cold are all somehow settling in at the same moment to hear the same story. Now, settle in deeper. Tonight we're going to a world that looks far more familiar than it actually is. It is the world of the American suburb in the 1950s, and it lasted in its purest form barely 15 years, yet it managed to leave behind more rules about how a woman should walk, talk, dress, host, and behave than entire centuries before it. Forget for a moment the woman in the magazine advertisement. You know the one. Crisp shirtwaist dress, leaning against a brand new refrigerator with her head tilted just slightly, smiling at absolutely nothing, because somewhere off to the side a photographer told her to bring her chin down a fraction and hold it there. That woman never really existed, not the way she gets remembered. She was 2 hours of pin curls and powder and a lighting rig, and an art director hovering just out of frame. Forget the kitchen from the television commercial too, the one that gleams like it has never in its life had a real meal cooked inside it. The actual version of 1954 is smaller than that. Stranger too, and it is happening right now behind a screen door in a brand new subdivision, where the paint on the porch trim is still faintly tacky if you press a thumbnail into it, and the lawn has not quite filled in from seed to something you could call grass. Maybe she's 26, 3 years married, with a baby finally down for a nap she's praying lasts another 40 minutes. Maybe she's 31, her second child just started kindergarten that September, and she has discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that the silence of an empty house on a weekday morning is a sound she did not know existed until she actually had to sit inside it. Right now, she is standing at her kitchen window, in a town with a name like Cedar something or Maple something, watching a street of houses that all went up within 18 months of one another. And she is doing something very specific with her morning. She's watching the street, not idly, carefully, because in roughly 40 minutes she's expected 3 houses down for coffee, with women she has known for exactly 19 days, and she has not yet decided what she's going to wear, and the decision matters far more than it has any business mattering. Here is the part nobody printed in the magazines. By almost every measure the era itself cared about, this was supposed to be the best life had ever been for a woman like her. The kitchen had a refrigerator with its own freezer compartment built right in. There was a car in the driveway, sometimes 2 by 1954. Her husband had a job with a pension folded quietly into it, a job he drove to in the morning and came home from at a predictable hour, which was its own small miracle if you asked her mother, who had lived through a depression and a war and had learned not to take predictable hours for granted. She had, in the specific language the period used about itself, everything. And yet she could feel, standing at that window with her coffee cooling in her hand, that there was a version of this particular Tuesday morning where she got the coffee call wrong, wore the wrong dress, said one wrong thing about somebody's casserole, and it would follow her. Not for a week, not even for a season, for years. She did not yet know which of the dozen unwritten rules she was most likely to break today. She only knew, with a kind of low, steady certainty, that the rules existed, that nobody had written them down anywhere she could actually go and study them, and that every other woman on this street seemed to have learned them long before she arrived. Let us slow down here for a moment, because to understand a single morning like this one, you have to understand the world that built it, and that world is younger than people usually assume. The subdivision she lives in did not exist 5 years earlier. In some cases, it did not exist 18 months earlier. The entire landscape of post-war American suburbia, the curving streets, The identical roof lines, the carports, the very idea of a neighbourhood assembled all at once rather than grown slowly over a century was something genuinely new under the sun, and it had been built at a speed that still strikes people today as almost unbelievable. The story usually begins with a man named William Levitt, though of course it is never really just one man, no matter how the story likes to simplify itself. Levitt and his family had been building houses on Long Island before the war, modest developments, nothing extraordinary. Then came the war itself, and with it, government contracts to build housing for naval personnel. And in that work, Levitt and his brother learned something that would reshape the American landscape more thoroughly than almost anything else built in the 20th century. They learned how to build a house the way Henry Ford had once learned how to build a car. Not one house at a time, slowly, by a single crew moving from foundation to roof. Instead, dozens of crews, each trained to do exactly one task, moving from house to house to house in a long mechanical procession. One crew poured foundations, another framed walls, another did nothing but install plumbing. All day, every day, the same 11 motions over and over until they could do them with their eyes half closed. A house that might once have taken the better part of a year to build could now go from bare earth to a family moving boxes in through the front door in a matter of weeks. When Levitt turned this machine loose on a patch of potato fields in Nassau County, New York, in 1947, what emerged was the first Levitt town, and it is hard now, looking at it from this distance, to convey just how strange and new it felt at the time. Here were thousands of houses nearly identical, laid out along gently curving streets that had never existed before, sold to young couples, many of them veterans, on terms that had simply never been available to ordinary working families before the war. No down payment in many cases, thanks to the GI Bill. A mortgage payment that came out by design to roughly what a family might already be paying in rent for a cramped city apartment. The waiting list stretched for miles. Families camped outside sales offices. People who had spent the war years in cramped apartments with in-laws or in trailers or in housing thrown up hastily near factory towns suddenly found themselves handed keys to an actual house with an actual yard of their very own. I want to be honest with you about something, because it would be easy to tell this story as simply a happy one, and it was not simply a happy one. Levittown, and the hundreds of imitators that followed it across the country through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, were built under restrictive policies that explicitly and deliberately excluded black families from buying homes there. This was not an oversight or an accidental byproduct of the market. It was written into the original deeds in places and reinforced through federal housing policy that, through an agency most people have never heard of, the Federal Housing Administration systematically refused to insure mortgages in neighborhoods it considered racially mixed or at risk of becoming so. The post-war suburb, in other words, was not simply a triumph of engineering and ambition. It was also a machine for sorting American families by race, and the wealth that home ownership built across the following decades, wealth that would eventually be passed down to children and grandchildren, flowed overwhelmingly toward white families because of policies written into the very blueprints of towns like the one our woman at the window is standing in tonight. This is not a detail to rush past. It sits underneath everything else in this story, quietly, the way a foundation sits underneath a house you can no longer see the foundation of. The women of these new suburbs built the rules themselves, almost feverishly, drawing on etiquette manuals and magazine columns and half-remembered fragments of their mother's more formal world, and within a remarkably short span of time, a code emerged, unwritten in any single place, understood by everyone, and enforced gently but absolutely by the women living under it. It is Monday morning where we are right now, though I should say the week itself does not really begin on Monday in this house, not in the way the calendar might suggest. It begins in a quieter sense on Sunday night, lying in bed, running through the 7 days ahead the way a general might review a campaign. Monday is washing, Tuesday is the coffee, Wednesday this particular week is a call she owes to the Whitfields 3 doors down, who moved in around the same time she did and who she has technically not yet returned a visit to, which is a debt of a very specific and very real kind in this world, even though no money changes hands. Thursday is bridge, assuming she is invited, which she suspects she will be, though one can never be entirely sure with Eleanor Garrity running the rotation. Friday is errands and a dress that needs letting out at the seam. Saturday is the dinner party, the Hendersons, which has been on the calendar penciled in for nearly 3 weeks now, and which she has been quietly dreading and quietly looking forward to in roughly equal measure. Sunday is church, and after church the particular ritual of standing on the church steps in the sun for exactly as long as is proper, and not 1 minute longer. That is the shape of an ordinary week in 1954, in a town like this one. Let us start with the washing, because Monday washing is older than this suburb, older than this decade, older really than the whole century, and it is worth understanding before we get to the newer, stranger rules that grew up around it. The rule that washing happens on Monday goes back generations, deep into the 19th century and probably further, and by the 1950s almost nobody questioned it any more than they questioned which way the sun came up. Sunday was for church and rest. Monday, refreshed, was for the heaviest and dirtiest work of the week, because by Monday the laundry basket had accumulated a full week's worth of linens and clothing, and because a woman who started the week with washing could move through the rest of her chores in a kind of descending order of unpleasantness. Tuesday for ironing what Monday had washed, Wednesday for mending and shopping, Thursday for some lighter cleaning task, Friday for the heavier cleaning, floors and baseboards and anything that had been let go during the week, Saturday for baking ahead of Sunday, and then Sunday itself, the one day a woman was in theory permitted to rest. In theory. We will come back to that particular fiction later because it really was mostly a fiction. By 1954, the actual mechanics of washing had changed enormously from what her own mother had known, and this is worth sitting with for a moment because it gets at something true about the whole decade. A woman in this kitchen, if she was lucky, and a great many of them now were, owned an automatic washing machine, a real one, not the wringer-style machine that had dominated the prior decade, where you fed wet clothing by hand through 2 rubber rollers and prayed you did not catch a finger in there along with the fabric. The newer machines filled themselves with water from a hose connection, agitated the clothes, drained, rinsed and spun nearly dry, all without a hand being laid on the clothing in between steps. It was, by any reasonable measure, a staggering improvement over the way laundry had been done for essentially all of human history up to that point. And yet, here is the thing that always strikes me about this period, the thing that I think is genuinely one of the most interesting facts about it, even though it rarely makes it into the nostalgic version of the story. The arrival of better machines did not actually reduce the time women spent on housework. Historians who have gone back and actually measured this, using time diaries that women kept during the period, have found something almost paradoxical. The hours spent on housekeeping in the average American home stayed roughly flat, or in some studies even crept upward slightly, across the very decades when washing machines and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators were becoming standard equipment in ordinary homes. The reason, once you sit with it, is not actually so mysterious. Standards rose to absorb the new capacity. A wringer washer that took half a day to process a week's laundry badly, with greying results and clothes that wore thin from the rough handling, was replaced by a machine that could wash a load in perhaps 40 minutes, cleanly, gently. But this did not mean women now had 4.5 free hours on Monday. It meant clothes were washed more often. It meant standards for what counted as clean rose to match what the machine could now achieve. Sheets that had once been changed every other week were now changed weekly. Shirts that had once been worn 2 days were now worn 1. The machine did not buy back time. It bought a higher ceiling, and the ceiling simply moved to meet it. There is something in that I find myself genuinely turning over even now telling you about it. We tend to imagine technological progress as something that hands you back hours of your life. Sometimes it does, but sometimes, and this period is one of the clearest examples in American history, It simply raises the bar of what is expected, and the hours get spent anyway, just on a more demanding version of the same task. So she is at the washer now, in the small room off the kitchen that the builder called a utility room on the floor plan, sorting whites from colours, checking pockets the way her mother taught her, a habit so deep she does it without thinking, fingers slipping into trouser pockets and finding, this particular Monday, a folded grocery receipt and a single shirt button that has come loose from somewhere and will need to be matched and sewn back on later in the week. The machine fills with a low mechanical groan, water rushing in, and there is a particular smell to a kitchen on washing day, soap powder and warm water, and the faint metallic tang of the machine itself working, that she has come in 3 years of marriage to associate with a kind of forward motion, the week beginning properly, the house resetting itself. While the machine works, there is the question of what she is wearing right now, this moment, alone in her own house with nobody scheduled to see her for another 2 hours. And this is where I think the real strangeness of 1954 starts to show itself. The part that tends to surprise people more than almost anything else about the period. Because the rules did not stop at the front door. They followed a woman into her own kitchen, into rooms with the curtains drawn, into hours when by any reasonable accounting nobody at all was watching. The etiquette manuals and magazine columns of the period were remarkably specific on this point and remarkably insistent. A woman was advised, repeatedly and from multiple directions, never to greet her husband at the end of his working day in the same house dress she had worn since breakfast, the logic being that a man who left a tidy, attractive wife in the morning and a fresh one in the evening had been given 2 small gifts rather than one continuous, slightly wilting gift. She was advised to do her hair and apply a little lipstick before he was due home, even on days when she had spent the entire afternoon scrubbing a kitchen floor or chasing a toddler through a yard. Dorothy Draper, whose advice columns ran in major papers and magazines through this period, and whose earlier book on home decoration and gracious living had made her something close to a household name among women of a certain income, wrote extensively about the idea that a woman's appearance was in effect a courtesy she owed not only to guests but to her own family, that there was something almost morally careless about a woman who let herself go slack within the privacy of her own walls. The Ladies' Home Journal, the single most influential women's magazine of the period, ran a column for years called "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" and reading through old issues you find, again and again, a quiet thread running underneath the specific marital problems being discussed, a suggestion that a wife's appearance, her grooming, her general level of polish, sat somewhere near the root of a great many domestic troubles, as though a loosened hairstyle and a husband's wandering eye were, if not directly connected, at least uncomfortably close neighbours in the magazine's worldview. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like simple cruelty, rules imposed on women by some faceless authority for no reason beyond control. The truth, as it usually is, sits in a more uncomfortable middle ground. Many women of this period did not experience these rules as oppression in the moment. They experienced them, a great many of them, as a kind of professionalism, the same instinct that makes a person dress a certain way for a job they take seriously. Homemaking, in the language the era used about itself constantly, was a profession, possibly the most important profession a woman could hold, and a professional did not show up to her own kitchen looking like she had given up. There is a kind of dignity in that framing that I do not want to dismiss too quickly, even while I notice, and I think you will notice too, that no equivalent rule existed for the husband, that nobody was writing columns suggesting a man freshen up his appearance before his wife came home from an afternoon of errands, that the entire elaborate apparatus of grooming and self-presentation ran, almost without exception, in one direction only. She has, this particular Monday, already changed out of her wash dress, the older cotton house dress, with a faint permanent grease stain near the hem that she keeps specifically for the dirtiest chores, into something a notch more presentable, even though the only person likely to see her in the next hour is the milkman, who comes by around 10 and who she will speak to for perhaps 90 seconds at the back door. This is not vanity exactly, or not only vanity. It is closer to readiness, a sense that the day could at any moment call on her to be seen, by a neighbour glancing over a fence, by a delivery man, by her own husband arriving home unexpectedly for some forgotten document, and that being caught unready carried a small, specific sting of embarrassment that she has learned, the way you learn anything repeated often enough, to simply avoid by habit rather than by conscious daily decision. There is an apron involved in all of this too, and I think the apron deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of those small objects that ends up carrying an entire decade's worth of meaning folded into its fabric. A woman of this period typically kept several aprons, and the distinctions between them were not casual. There was the heavy, full coverage apron for the truly dirty work, scrubbing floors, cleaning the oven, the kind of task that risked real damage to whatever dress was underneath. There was a second, lighter apron, often with some decorative trim, a ruffle or a bit of eyelet lace for ordinary cooking, the kind a woman might still be wearing if a neighbour dropped by unannounced without causing any alarm. And then there was, most importantly of all, no apron at all, the moment a guest was actually expected or actually arrived. If the doorbell rang without warning, the practiced motion was instant, apron off, folded or simply flung onto a hook just inside the kitchen door, hands smoothed quickly down the front of the dress underneath, a fast check in whatever mirror happened to be nearest, and then the door opened with an expression that suggested she had been doing something considerably more decorative than scrubbing a roasting pan only 15 seconds earlier. It was a small performance repeated so many times across a single week that it had stopped feeling like performance at all. It had simply become the shape of her day. The washing finishes gets hung or fed through the wringer attachment on the side of the machine and then hung properly on the line out back, because even in 1954, with electric dryers beginning to appear in the more affluent homes on the street, there remains something close to a moral preference for line drying among the women here. A sense that sheets dried in the sun and wind smell a particular way that no machine has yet learnt to fake. And besides, hanging the wash is its own kind of announcement to the street, a signal, intentional or not, of industriousness, of a household running properly and on schedule. A woman whose wash is still hanging on the line at 4 in the afternoon has, without anyone saying a word about it, told her neighbours something about herself, and it is not a flattering something. By the time the wash is up, it is nearly time to think about tomorrow, and tomorrow is the coffee. Now I want to spend some real time on the coffee morning, because if you wanted to find the single institution that best captures the strange, intricate, almost diplomatic complexity of suburban women's social lives in this period, you would be hard-pressed to find a better one. On the surface, nothing could sound simpler. A group of women gather at one another's houses mid-morning for coffee and conversation, perhaps something sweet to go with it, perhaps not, depending on whose turn it is and how elaborate that particular hostess tends to run. It sounds, described that way, almost nothing at all. And yet underneath that simple description sat a structure with rules so specific, so carefully understood by everyone involved, that a woman could violate one of them without even realizing she had done so, and find the consequences arriving slowly, quietly over the following weeks, in the form of invitations that simply stopped coming, or came less often, or arrived with a faint, hard-to-name coolness attached to them that she could sense without being able to point to a single cause. Here is how it actually worked. On a street like this one, in a town like this one, in the spring and summer of 1954, the coffee morning rotated, generally, among a fairly stable group of women, typically somewhere between 6 and 12 of them, drawn from a few adjoining streets, or sometimes a single street if the street was long enough and the women got along well enough. The rotation itself carried meaning. To be included in the regular rotation was to have, in effect, been accepted into the neighbourhood's inner social structure. To be left out of it, while perhaps still greeted pleasantly enough at the mailbox or the grocery store, was to occupy a kind of social limbo that everybody understood and nobody discussed directly. Getting included in the first place followed its own set of unwritten steps, and this is where our woman at the window, 3 weeks into her new house, finds herself navigating territory with no map. The arrival of a new family on the street was by custom supposed to be met first by a call from the woman or women already established there, typically someone positioned as something close to an informal welcoming committee, though nobody held that title officially. This call was meant to happen within a reasonably prompt window after the moving truck pulled away, not so soon as to seem intrusive while boxes were still being unpacked, not so late as to seem cold or uninterested. A week to 10 days was generally considered correct. The established woman would walk over, knock, introduce herself, perhaps bring something small, a coffee cake, a jar of homemade preserves, and stay for what etiquette manuals of the period specified, with a precision that strikes the modern ear as almost comic, as somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. Longer risked overstaying a welcome into a house still in chaos, shorter risked seeming perfunctory, a box checked rather than a genuine gesture extended. The new arrival was then expected to return this visit, and here the clock truly started running in a way that mattered. The standard etiquette of the period, the kind taught in manuals and assumed as common knowledge among women who had grown up learning their way around streets very much like this one, held that a first call from a neighbor or acquaintance should be returned within roughly a week, certainly no longer than 2. To let it slide longer than that was not necessarily a catastrophe, but it registered. It registered as a small, specific kind of carelessness, the social equivalent of forgetting a thank you note, and in a tightly observed new community where every house could see every other house's driveway and front walk, that kind of carelessness did not go unnoticed for long. She knows this. It is in fact precisely the debt she has been turning over in her mind regarding the Whitfields 3 doors down, whose welcoming visit she received 12 days ago now, and whose visit she has, through a combination of a sick child and a genuinely overwhelming first month of unpacking, not yet returned. 12 days. She does the arithmetic almost without meaning to, the way you check the time on a clock you have already glanced at twice in the last 5 minutes. Wednesday, she has decided, cannot be put off any further. The coffee itself, once a woman was settled into the rotation, carried its own elaborate unspoken choreography. Hosting duties moved from house to house, generally on a schedule everyone simply seemed to know, sometimes formalized through a small notebook one of the more organized women kept, more often simply held in the collective memory of the group, the way a folk song gets passed along without anyone writing down the sheet music. The hostess was expected to have her house, or at minimum the rooms a guest would actually see, in a state that suggested effortless order rather than visible labor. The contradiction embedded in that expectation is worth pausing on, because it sat at the center of a great deal of quiet female exhaustion in this period. The house needed to look as though it always looked this way, as though no scramble had occurred in the 90 minutes before the doorbell rang, even though in the overwhelming majority of cases, a very real scramble had occurred. Vacuuming done at speed, a quick wipe down of a bathroom sink, flowers cut from the yard and arranged in a vase with more haste than the final result let on. Refreshments followed their own unwritten gradient of acceptability. Coffee always made fresh, never reheated from an earlier pot. A detail that sounds trivial until you understand how closely it was watched. A plate of something sweet was customary, though not strictly mandatory. And here the social calculus grew genuinely intricate. A homemade coffee cake or a fresh batch of cookies signaled effort, care. A hostess who had risen that morning thinking specifically of her guests. A store-bought item, while increasingly available and increasingly convenient as the decade wore on and supermarket bakery sections expanded, carried, in many of these circles, a faint whiff of corner cutting. Some women managed this tension through a small, almost universally practiced deception, transferring a bakery item onto their own serving plate, removing any box or wrapper before guests arrived, allowing the cake to speak silently as though it had emerged from their own oven that morning. Nobody ever quite admitted to doing this, and yet everybody seemed to suspect that everybody else occasionally did it too. which made it one of those open secrets that an entire social world quietly agreed to pretend it did not see. Conversation at these gatherings followed its own narrow, carefully patrolled channels, and we will come back to this in more depth later because it deserves real attention. For now it is enough to say that certain topics were understood almost instinctively as safe the weather, recipes, children's minor achievements, recent purchases for the home, while other topics, money specifically, anything that touched too directly on how much a husband earned or how a family's finances actually stood, politics, religion beyond the most surface agreement that church attendance was a fine and good thing, were treated as a kind of conversational minefield best avoided entirely. A woman who strayed too often or too pointedly into the wrong territory risked being quietly, gradually recategorized. Not unfriended exactly, the word would not have meant anything in 1954, but shifted almost imperceptibly from someone genuinely sought out to someone merely tolerated, and running underneath every single one of these coffee mornings, unspoken but absolutely understood by every woman present, sat a hierarchy, and the hierarchy had almost nothing to do with the women themselves and almost everything to do with their husbands. This is worth slowing down for because it is one of those facts about the period that, once you really sit with it, reorganizes how you picture an entire decade of suburban life. A woman standing on her own street, the warmth or coolness with which she was treated, the speed with which invitations found their way to her mailbox, the deference or its absence in the small daily exchanges over fences and at mailboxes, was determined to a degree that strikes the modern ear as almost startling by her husband's job title and his income bracket. Not by her own intelligence or her own warmth or her own capability, though these things certainly mattered at the margins, softening or sharpening how a given ranking actually felt to live inside. But the ranking itself, the basic coordinates of where she stood, were set elsewhere, in an office downtown that she had never set foot in, by a salary figure she sometimes did not even know with precision herself. The hierarchy worked roughly like this, and you have to remember that within a single Levittown-style subdivision, the range of occupations was not actually as narrow as the visual uniformity of the houses might suggest. A junior engineer at a manufacturing firm and a senior sales manager at the same firm might live 3 houses apart, in houses that looked from the street essentially identical, and yet everyone on the street understood, with a precision that never needed to be spoken aloud, that these were not equivalent households. The wife of the man further up the company's structure was, by a kind of social gravity that nobody had designed but everyone obeyed, positioned slightly higher in any given gathering. She was more likely to be consulted on questions of taste, more likely to have her opinions on a recipe or a piece of furniture quietly adopted by the others, more likely, frankly, to end up at the unofficial center of whichever circle she belonged to, rather than at its edges. This hierarchy expressed itself through 1,000 tiny signals rather than any single obvious one, whose house the larger gatherings tended to gravitate toward, even when the rotation theoretically gave everyone equal turns, whose comments drew the quickest agreement around a coffee table, whose children were invited to whose birthday parties with a slightly higher hit rate than pure chance would predict. None of it was ever named directly as what it was. To have spoken the hierarchy aloud would have violated the entire delicate fiction the neighborhood depended on. The comforting idea that this was a community of equals, all in the same boat, all building the same kind of life together on the same kind of street. The fiction mattered enormously, and in a great many real ways it was not entirely false. These women genuinely did share an enormous amount, the same age range, the same basic domestic concerns, the same television programs, the same brand new houses bought on the same kind of mortgage. But underneath that real and substantial common ground ran a current that everybody felt and almost nobody acknowledged. And the woman new to the street 3 weeks in was already, without anyone explaining it to her in so many words, beginning to sense roughly where her own husband's position at the regional office placed her, relative to Eleanor Garrity's husband, who ran the bridge rotation and whose husband had, as it happened, recently been made a partner at his firm, a fact that everyone on the street somehow knew within about a week of it happening. despite nobody having any obvious way of finding out. I find myself genuinely fascinated by how thoroughly this hierarchy operated through inference rather than disclosure, because discussing money directly was, as I mentioned, one of the great forbidden topics of suburban female conversation. A woman would never ask another woman directly what her husband earned, and yet the information circulated anyway through a kind of constant, low-level decoding that every woman on the street participated in without ever quite admitting to it. The car in the driveway, and whether it was new this year or the year before, the brand of appliances visible through an open kitchen door during a coffee visit, whether a family took a proper vacation that summer, and where and for how long, whether the children's school clothes in September looked freshly purchased or carefully handed down. A woman could walk into another woman's kitchen for 40 minutes of coffee and conversation about absolutely nothing controversial whatsoever, and walk out having silently updated, with real precision, her sense of exactly where that household sat on the ladder, all without a single number having been spoken aloud by either party. There is something almost admirable in the sheer subtlety of the system, even while there is something genuinely sad in it too, and I think both things can be true at once without cancelling each other out. These were intelligent women, operating an enormously complex social instrument with no formal training in it whatsoever. No manual that actually spelled out the hierarchy in plain terms, only inherited instinct and careful observation, and the kind of social intelligence that simply does not show up on any resume from this period, because nobody thought to call it a skill. Wednesday arrives, and with it, the visit she owes the Whitfields. The custom of calling, paying a social visit, returning a social visit, owing a social visit, descended directly from a much older and more formal Victorian and Edwardian practice, the calling card system, in which a lady of means kept a small case of printed cards bearing her name and used them according to an elaborate code that governed who called on whom, in what order, within what window of time, and what it meant if a card was left without the lady herself coming to the door, which was, in that older system, itself a specific and legible signal, a way of acknowledging a connection while keeping it at a careful, deliberate distance. By 1954, the printed calling card itself had largely faded from ordinary suburban life, kept on by only the most formal or socially ambitious households. But the underlying logic of calling, the idea that visits were owed, returned, tracked, and that the timing and conduct of a visit communicated something real about the relationship between two households, had survived almost entirely intact, simply shedding its more aristocratic trappings and adapting itself to ranch houses and station wagons. The etiquette columns of the period, including the enormously influential ones written under Dorothy Draper's name, and the steady stream of advice running through the Ladies' Home Journal and similar publications, spent a remarkable amount of column space on the precise mechanics of this, because evidently a great many women genuinely needed and wanted the guidance, suggesting that even at the time the rules felt complicated enough to require a kind of standing reference. The basic shape of it, as it operated on a street like this one, went something like this. A new arrival to the neighbourhood was to be called upon, as I mentioned, within a reasonably prompt window by an established neighbour. That visit was to be returned within roughly a week to 2 weeks, no longer, and the returned visit was understood as a kind of social acceptance of the connection, an agreement unspoken that this relationship would now continue forward on some regular basis. To fail to return a call within a reasonable window was read, whether or not it was intended this way, as a quiet declining of the relationship, a closing of a door that had been gently opened. This created, as you might imagine, a near constant low hum of social bookkeeping running underneath the surface of everyday suburban life, every woman holding in her head a running tally of calls owed and calls paid, debts incurred and debts settled, a ledger kept entirely in memory and goodwill rather than in any actual book, though some of the more meticulous women genuinely did keep a small notebook for exactly this purpose, jotting down who had called when, who still needed returning, the way you might track Christmas cards sent and received. She walks the 3 houses down to the Whitfields a little before 11, in a day dress she has chosen with more deliberation than the task probably warrants, gloves on despite the short distance, because gloves in this period were not really about the cold or the practical protection of one's hands. They were a marker of having dressed properly to be seen in public, even in public that consisted of nothing more than 100 yards of sidewalk between one driveway and another. A woman who stepped outside her own front door without gloves on, even for an errand as brief as this one, risked the small but real discomfort of feeling, in her own words and the words of the manuals she had absorbed, not quite finished, not quite dressed, exposed in some faint way that had nothing to do with how much skin was actually showing. The visit itself, once she arrives, follows its own quiet choreography. She is shown into a front room that has clearly been given a quick once-over in anticipation, magazines straightened on the coffee table, a vase of cut flowers that she suspects correctly were cut from the yard within the last hour specifically for this occasion. Coffee is offered and accepted. The conversation moves through its safe and familiar channels. The weather, which has been unusually warm for this point in the spring. The children, the Whitfields, have two, both younger than her own son. The general business of settling into a new house, which curtains fit which windows and which absolutely did not. The names of a few shops downtown that Mrs. Whitfield, on the strength of having arrived 4 months earlier, can now recommend with the easy authority of a seasoned local guide. Neither woman mentions money or her husband's exact position or anything that could be read as probing, and yet by the time she rises to leave, somewhere close to the 25-minute mark, which she has been tracking without consciously deciding to track it, she has formed a reasonably clear picture of who the Whitfields are, what kind of household this is, where it likely sits, and whether this is a friendship worth investing further effort into cultivating. This is the part that I think is genuinely remarkable about the whole system when you really look at it. An enormous amount of real information was exchanged in these visits, almost none of it stated directly. Borrowing and lending between houses on a street like this one operated under its own distinct, equally unwritten code, and this is worth its own moment, because it touches something that ran even deeper than the etiquette of calling. A cup of sugar borrowed mid-recipe, an egg needed urgently because a cake was already half assembled, and the carton in the refrigerator had turned up unexpectedly empty, a folding chair lent for an unexpected gathering. These small exchanges happened constantly between neighbouring households, and they were, in their way, one of the genuine warm currents running through suburban female life, a real and practical safety net built entirely out of proximity and goodwill. But even this had rules, and the rules mattered. The cardinal principle, understood by every woman on a street like this one without ever being formally explained, was that a borrowed item was returned, and returned in a condition equal to or better than the condition in which it had been borrowed, and ideally returned with some small addition attached. An extra cup of sugar alongside the original cup, a few additional cookies on the plate beyond what had simply been borrowed flour and butter to make. To fail at this, to return a borrowed pie dish unwashed, or to simply let a small loan slide without acknowledgement, was a genuine, if minor, social offence, the kind of thing that did not end a friendship outright, but that got remembered, filed away, factored quietly into future calculations about how reliable, how careful, how truly considerate this particular neighbour actually was. There is something almost touching in how seriously this was taken. A cup of sugar treated with something approaching the gravity of an actual financial transaction, except that the currency being protected was not money. It was trust and reputation and the felt sense of being a good neighbour, which in this world counted for almost as much as money did, and in certain moods counted for considerably more. Thursday brings bridge, and the invitation, as it happens, does arrive. Slipped through the mail slot on Wednesday afternoon in a small envelope addressed in Eleanor Garrity's distinctive, slightly forward-leaning handwriting, the kind of handwriting that has clearly been practiced and refined over many years of writing exactly this sort of note. She feels something close to relief reading it, a small private exhale, because bridge, more than the coffee mornings, more even than the dinner parties, functioned as a kind of inner sanctum on a street like this one, and being included in it meant something specific and durable, in a way that a single coffee morning invitation, however pleasant, did not quite carry. Bridge clubs proliferated across suburban America with a speed that, looking back, seems almost startling, and it is worth pausing to understand why this particular card game, of all possible card games, became so thoroughly woven into the social architecture of an entire generation of American women. Contract bridge had actually become enormously popular across the country back in the 1930s, championed in large part by a flamboyant, relentlessly self-promoting man named Ellie Culbertson, who wrote best-selling books on bridge strategy and somehow managed to turn card game etiquette into something close to a national obsession during the Depression years, when, as it happens, an inexpensive evening of cards at a friend's house was exactly the kind of entertainment a great many families could actually still afford. By the 1950s, bridge had settled into something less like a fad and more like a permanent fixture, particularly among women for whom a weekly or bi-weekly bridge game offered something the coffee morning, with its rotating cast and somewhat more open guest list, did not quite provide. Bridge required a fixed number of players, exactly 4 to a table, which meant a bridge club once formed tended to calcify into a genuinely stable closed group, the same 8 or 12 women, organized into tables meeting on the same schedule month after month, year after year. Getting into an established bridge club was, in a very real sense, harder than getting into the looser rotation of the coffee circuit, and it carried correspondingly more weight once achieved. The game itself was taken seriously, more seriously, I think, than people now tend to assume when they picture it. This was not idle entertainment exactly, or not only idle entertainment. Bridge demands real memory, real calculation, a genuine facility with probability and inference, reading your partner's bids, reading the cards already played, working out what must still be sitting unseen in your opponent's hands. A great many of these women were, by the standards of any era, sharp, strategic minds, and bridge offered one of the very few socially sanctioned arenas in which that sharpness could be displayed, openly, competitively, without violating any of the broader cultural expectations about feminine modesty and deference that governed almost every other part of their lives. I find that worth noting because it complicates the easy picture of total domestic stupor that sometimes gets attached to this decade. A woman who spent her coffee mornings carefully avoiding any appearance of having a strong opinion about politics might, 3 hours later at the bridge table, calculate a finesse with a kind of focused, almost ruthless precision that nobody in the room would have dreamed of calling unfeminine, because card sense somehow slipped through a loophole that intellectual confidence in almost any other context did not. The gathering itself, this particular Thursday, is at the Garrity's, as it usually is, since Eleanor, by some combination of seniority, force of personality, and the simple fact that her husband's recent partnership has nudged the household's standing slightly upward, has settled into something close to a permanent hosting role, with the other women rotating through as occasional hosts more out of politeness than any real expectation that the rotation will displace her for long. The living room has been rearranged for the occasion, 2 card tables set up with a precision that suggests this furniture has performed this exact function many times before. Ashtrays positioned at careful intervals, a plate of small sandwiches and another of cookies laid out on the sideboard, coffee in a percolator kept warm nearby, and, this being 1954 rather than some later, more health-conscious decade, a faint persistent haze of cigarette smoke that nobody in the room thinks twice about, since smoking was, for women of this era and this social standing, less a vice than a kind of sophisticated punctuation mark, something Bette Davis did in the pictures with real elegance, something a magazine advertisement might show a slim, contented housewife enjoying on her own back porch after the children were finally down. The unwritten rules of bridge club extended well beyond the actual play of cards. A hostess was expected to provide refreshments of a certain caliber, not extravagant but clearly considered, homemade where possible, and there existed among the women in any given club a genuine if gentle competitive undercurrent regarding whose spread looked the most effortlessly impressive. Punctuality mattered enormously, since a fourth player arriving late left an entire table stalled, unable to begin, the other three women making increasingly strained small talk while glancing, with growing frequency, toward the front window. Conversation between hands followed the same general safe channels as the coffee mornings, though bridge clubs, being smaller and more established, sometimes permitted a slightly franker tone once real trust had built up over months and years of regular play. An inside joke here, a slightly more candid comment about a husband's habits there, the kind of looser talk that could only happen once a woman had proven herself, over time, to be discreet, to be someone whose confidence would not leak back out into the wider, less forgiving currents of the broader neighborhood. And here, I think, is where something genuinely tender starts to show itself underneath all this careful structure. Something that the magazines of the period, and frankly a great many later popular accounts of the decade, tend to flatten or miss entirely. For a number of these women, the bridge table represented something close to the only sustained, regular, adult, intellectual and social companionship available to them in an entire week. Their days otherwise were largely populated by small children, by household tasks performed alone, by brief transactional exchanges with delivery men and shopkeepers. The husband came home in the evening tired, often not particularly inclined toward extended conversation about anything beyond his own workday, and in any case the prevailing wisdom of the era, reinforced constantly in the advice columns, suggested a wife's job at that hour was to listen, to soothe, to manage his mood rather than to unload her own. Bridge night, for 3 or 4 hours, on a regular and reliable schedule, offered something different. A room full of women who understood, without being told, exactly what the day had probably contained, who could laugh at a shared frustration without needing it explained first, who offered in the specific, bounded, ritualized container of a card game something that today we might simply call friendship, but that the language of the period rarely named so plainly, treating it instead as merely a pleasant social obligation, a box checked on the weekly calendar, rather than what it actually was for a great many women, which was something close to a lifeline. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs almost exclusively to this period, and it is worth describing carefully, because it does not look like loneliness the way we usually picture the word. It does not look like an empty house or an unanswered phone or a calendar with nothing written on it. If anything, the calendar of a woman like the one we are following tonight looked almost the opposite of empty. Coffee on Tuesday, bridge on Thursday, calls owed and returned throughout the week, a dinner party on the weekend, church on Sunday with its own following ritual of standing on the steps afterward in conversation with women she had, in a strict sense, just spent the better part of an hour sitting beside in a pew. By any reasonable external measure, her life was full of people, full of structure, full of the precise kind of community that later decades would look back on with a certain wistful envy, a sense that something had been lost when neighborhoods stopped knowing each other this thoroughly, when women stopped having quite this many scheduled, reliable points of contact across an ordinary week. And yet, a great many of these women, by their own private accounts that mostly surfaced only later in interviews conducted by writers and sociologists who went looking for them in subsequent decades, in letters and diaries that occasionally survived where their authors did not expect them to be read, described feeling, underneath all that structure, a peculiar and persistent isolation, not the absence of people, the absence of being truly known by any of them, because the very rules that made the social fabric of a street like this one function so smoothly, the careful avoidance of money talk, the relentless steering away from politics and religion and anything genuinely difficult, the performed cheerfulness expected at every coffee morning and bridge table and dinner party, also meant that almost nothing real was ever actually said out loud. A woman could spend 4 hours a week at the bridge table with the same 3 companions for years, could know precisely how each of them took her coffee and which of them had a temper, and which of them never missed a hand of cards no matter how distracted she seemed, and still never once hear any of them say plainly that she was unhappy or frightened about money, or exhausted in a way sleep did not seem to fix, or unsure whether she actually loved the man she had married, because saying any of that out loud would have broken something the entire group depended on, the shared fiction that everyone here was managing beautifully, that the life on offer in 1954 really was the good life the magazines kept promising, and that any private trouble was therefore a personal failing rather than a structural condition shared almost certainly by every single woman quietly sitting at that same card table. This is, I think, the real shape of the paradox we started with tonight. Standing at that kitchen window before any of this had unfolded, she has everything the magazines told her to want: a new house, a husband with a steady position and a pension attached to it, a car, a community of women who call on her, invite her, sit beside her at church, laugh with her over cards. And she could, on any given evening, lie awake beside her sleeping husband and feel something close to entirely alone, not because nobody was present in her life, but because the rules governing every single one of those presences forbade the specific, plain, unguarded honesty that might have made any of them feel like real company, rather than a beautifully maintained performance everyone had silently agreed to keep giving each other. A name would eventually get attached to this feeling, though not for some years yet: Betty Friedan. Doing the research that would become her landmark book, published toward the end of the decade that followed this one, interviewed women across precisely this kind of suburban landscape, and found, again and again, a sensation many of them could not properly name: a vague, persistent, guilty dissatisfaction sitting underneath lives that looked, by every external measure available to the culture at the time, completely successful. She called it eventually the problem that has no name, and the phrase stuck because it captured something true, that the women experiencing it often could not identify what exactly was wrong, only that something was, and that admitting it felt close to an act of ingratitude, a betrayal of the very life they had been told, from every direction, to want. I do not say any of this to suggest that every woman on a street like this one was secretly miserable behind her smile, because that would be its own kind of flattening, its own way of refusing the actual texture and variety of individual lives. Some women genuinely thrived inside this structure, found real satisfaction in running a household well, in raising children carefully, in the particular competence required to manage a complex social calendar with grace. The truth, as it almost always is, sat somewhere in the genuinely complicated middle, different for every woman, shifting even within a single woman across different weeks and different moods. But the structure itself, the rules, the relentless performance of cheerfulness, the absolute prohibition on saying anything too plainly true at the coffee table, created conditions under which loneliness could flourish in plain sight, disguised almost perfectly as community. That is the part I keep returning to. Not that the community was fake exactly, it was real in its way and it mattered, and it genuinely sustained a great many of these women through difficult stretches of early marriage and young motherhood that they might otherwise have faced in true isolation. But it was also simultaneously a structure built to prevent anyone inside it from ever quite saying the whole truth, and a community that cannot hold the whole truth of its members is in the end only doing half its job, however warmly it does the other half. Friday arrives quieter than the days before it, a kind of held breath before the weekend, and it is on a street like this one, the day of errands and preparation, the day a woman gets the house and herself ready for whatever the weekend has scheduled, which in this particular week means the Hendersons' dinner party on Saturday evening, an event that has been sitting on the calendar for nearly 3 weeks now, long enough to have generated its own small undercurrent of anticipation and quiet nerves. The morning is given over to a dress that needs letting out slightly at the seam, a small alteration she has been putting off since the previous week, and she sits at the sewing machine in the spare bedroom that doubles, on these occasions, as a sort of workroom, the machine humming under her hands with a steadiness that she finds, if she is honest, genuinely satisfying, one of the small pleasures of this domestic world that rarely gets mentioned alongside its more obvious burdens. Sewing was not, for most women of this period, a chore in quite the same category as scrubbing a floor. It carried its own quiet competence, its own visible skill, the kind of thing a woman could point to, even if only to herself, as evidence of genuine capability. Patterns were widely available, inexpensive, sold at the fabric counters of department stores and through mail-order catalogues, and a great many women of this era could, given an afternoon and a length of fabric, produce a dress that looked, from across a room, indistinguishable from something purchased ready-made at considerably greater expense. The errands that follow take her downtown, to the small cluster of shops that have grown up to serve this and the neighbouring subdivisions, a grocer, a pharmacy with a soda counter along one wall, a dry goods store, a beauty parlour she visits every other week for a set, and occasionally, on special occasions like tomorrow night, a proper wash and style. The grocery list for the dinner party has been building all week in the back of a kitchen notebook, ingredients for whatever dish she has committed to bringing, since the Hendersons, like most hosts in this particular circle, follow the increasingly common practice of asking each guest to contribute something specific, rather than producing an entire meal single-handedly. A custom that, depending on which etiquette authority you consulted, was either a sensible modern adaptation to the genuine labour involved in entertaining, or a faint dilution of proper hospitality, depending on how traditionally minded the authority in question happened to be. This is perhaps the right moment to talk about Dorothy Draper specifically, because her name has come up a few times tonight already, and she sat at the centre of a great deal of what these women understood about how a proper home and a proper hostess were supposed to look and behave. Draper had built her reputation in an earlier era as an interior decorator of real flamboyance and confidence, the kind of decorator who favoured bold colours and dramatic flourishes at a time when more muted, cautious taste dominated fashionable homes, and by the 1940s and into the 1950s she had translated that reputation into a second career as a kind of household authority, writing books and newspaper columns that reached a far broader audience than her original decorating clients ever could have, an audience made up overwhelmingly of exactly the kind of suburban housewife we are spending tonight with. Her advice ranged across an enormous territory: the correct way to set a table, the correct way to arrange flowers, the correct attitude a hostess should cultivate toward her own anxiety about entertaining, which Draper addressed with surprising directness, acknowledging in print that hostessing produced real nerves in real women and offering practical reassurance alongside the more familiar prescriptive rules. The Ladies' Home Journal occupied a related but distinct role in this same landscape, less a single authoritative voice like Draper's and more a constant steady drumbeat of guidance arriving monthly into millions of American homes, covering marriage and homemaking and child-rearing, and, threaded through all of it, the specific etiquette of a woman's social obligations. The magazine's circulation by the middle of the decade had climbed into the millions, making it one of the most widely read publications in the entire country, and its influence on how an ordinary suburban woman understood her own obligations, her own standards, her own sense of what a good wife and good neighbour actually did with her week, is difficult to overstate. A woman did not need to have read a single specific article to feel its influence, because the magazine's sensibility had saturated the broader culture so thoroughly that its assumptions arrived second-hand, through other women, through her own mother, through the simple ambient pressure of an entire culture pointing, with remarkable unanimity, in the same direction. By early afternoon she is back home, groceries put away, the dress finished and hung in the closet ready for tomorrow evening, and there remains the question of the dish itself, which she has decided after some deliberation will be a moulded gelatin salad, a category of dish that occupied a genuinely strange and specific place in the culinary culture of this period. Gelatin combined with vegetables or fruit, or sometimes, in combinations that strike the modern palate as faintly bewildering, both at once, suspended and set into elaborate decorative moulds that, once turned out onto a serving plate, were meant to wobble slightly and catch the light in a way that read at the time as genuinely impressive rather than, as it might read now, slightly alarming. The gelatin salad's popularity through this decade owed a great deal to the convenience revolution sweeping through American kitchens, powdered gelatin mixes that had simply not existed in this form a generation earlier, refrigerators reliable and roomy enough to properly set a large mold overnight, and a magazine culture eager to showcase the latest possibilities these new tools made available. She has made this particular mold before, knows its quirks, knows exactly how long it needs in the refrigerator, and exactly how to ease it from its tin without disaster. And there is something genuinely calming this Friday afternoon in performing a task she has already mastered. No improvisation required, simply the quiet satisfaction of competence repeated. Saturday evening, finally the Hendersons' dinner party, and I want to walk through this slowly because the dinner party, more than almost any other single institution in this entire social world, reveals just how much invisible labor and invisible rule following sat underneath an evening that was meant to look to every guest walking through the door like nothing more than a pleasant, relaxed gathering among friends. The invitation itself had arrived nearly 3 weeks earlier by mail on a small card, and the timing of that invitation followed its own quiet convention. Proper notice for a dinner party of this kind ran somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks, long enough that guests could genuinely plan around it, short enough that it did not feel like an event being organized so far in advance that its purpose grew vague. An invitation extended only a few days ahead, except among the closest and most informal friendships, risked suggesting either disorganization on the host's part, or worse, that the guests in question were something of an afterthought, invited only once a more desired guest had declined. None of this was ever stated, all of it was understood. Arrival time mattered enormously, and this is one of those small details that I think genuinely surprises people when they first learn it, because it cuts directly against modern instinct. The correct time to arrive at a dinner party in this period was not promptly on the hour stated on the invitation, and certainly never early. The genuinely correct window ran somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes past the stated time, no more than that, since arriving too early risked catching a hostess still visibly in the throes of last-minute preparation, an apron not yet removed, a husband still mixing the first round of cocktails, the kind of behind-the-scenes chaos that the entire elaborate apparatus of hostessing existed specifically to prevent guests from ever witnessing. Arriving more than 20 minutes late, on the other hand, risked holding up the entire evening's careful timing, a roast resting too long, other guests left making conversation on empty stomachs, cocktails consumed on too little food for too long. The acceptable window, in other words, was narrow, specific, and entirely unstated on the invitation itself, simply assumed, the way a person today simply assumes certain unwritten rules about replying to a text message within some reasonable but unspecified span of time. She and her husband arrive at 11 minutes past 7, which she has timed with more precision than she would ever admit out loud. And there is immediately the question of the hostess gift, which she has brought a small box of good chocolates, wrapped, though some women in this circle favour flowers instead, or occasionally a small decorative item for the home, a candle dish, a set of cocktail napkins, something modest enough not to seem like an attempt at one-upmanship, and yet considered enough to demonstrate real thoughtfulness. The gift, handed over at the door with a few words of greeting, is one of the small fixed rituals of the evening, and to arrive without one, except among the very closest and most informal friendships, would have registered faintly but unmistakably as a small social shortfall. Inside, the cocktail hour has already begun, and this part of the evening, the 30 to 45 minutes before dinner, is actually served, functioned as its own distinct social phase with its own rules. Husbands and wives mingled together at this stage, unlike the deeper segregation that some of the more elaborate, formal entertaining of an earlier generation had favoured, and conversation ranged across a slightly wider territory than the strictly female gatherings of the coffee morning or bridge table allowed, since the presence of the husbands shifted the topics permissible. Work talk among the men, a bit more political commentary than the women's circles alone would typically tolerate, though even here a hostess was expected to steer firmly away from anything that risked real disagreement curdling the mood before dinner had even been served. The hostess herself, throughout this cocktail hour, performed a particular kind of constant low-level vigilance that I think deserves real attention, because it represents one of the clearest examples of what later writers would eventually name emotional labor, decades before that phrase existed to describe it. She tracked more or less continuously and without any visible effort whether every guest's glass needed refreshing, whether any conversation had stalled into an awkward silence requiring a gentle redirect, whether any two guests seemed to be drifting toward a topic likely to cause friction, whether the timing in the kitchen remained on track for the meal itself, all of this happening simultaneously, behind a face that was meanwhile expected to project nothing but warm, relaxed, effortless pleasure at having everyone gathered here tonight. The skill required for this, sustained across an entire evening every single week or every other week for years on end, was genuinely considerable, and it received in the language and economy of the period no formal recognition whatsoever. It was simply what a good hostess did. It did not have a name, it was not a job, it was supposedly just personality, just feminine instinct, the same invisible category that absorbed so much of what these women actually did. Dinner itself, when it finally came around 8, followed its own seating logic. Husbands and wives separated rather than seated together, a convention inherited from much older formal dining traditions, the theory being that married couples already had ample opportunity to speak with one another at home, and that a dinner party existed precisely to broaden each guest's conversation for an evening, paired instead with someone else's spouse, ideally someone with whom an interesting conversation might unfold. The hostess herself bore responsibility for working out this seating arrangement in advance, a task that required real social calculation, balancing personalities, separating anyone likely to clash, ensuring no guest found themselves seated beside someone they had little in common with for the better part of 2 hours. And then there was the food itself, and the specific ritual of how a hostess was expected to receive any compliment paid to it. And this particular custom strikes me even now as one of the strangest and most quietly revealing rules of the entire decade. A meal that had taken the better part of an afternoon to prepare, a roast carefully timed, a sauce built from scratch, a dessert layered and frosted with real skill, was to be presented to compliments with something close to automatic self-deprecation. "Oh, it's nothing really. I hope it's not too dry. I was never quite sure about the timing. It's just a simple recipe, nothing special." This was not modesty exactly, or rather it was modesty performed according to a very specific social script, because a hostess who instead simply said thank you, accepting the compliment plainly, acknowledging the real skill and real labor behind the result, risked coming across as immodest, as too pleased with herself, as a woman who had forgotten her place in a culture that prized, above almost anything else in a woman's public presentation, an appearance of easy, unforced humility. So the dance continued, compliment offered, compliment deflected, compliment offered again with slightly more insistence, deflected again, both parties performing a small ritual that everyone present understood perfectly, and that nobody, as far as I have ever found in the record, ever once stepped outside of to simply say out loud that the food was wonderful and the cook knew it and there was nothing wrong with knowing it. After the meal, the evening typically shifted again, the women sometimes moving to one room for coffee and dessert, while the men lingered briefly over a final drink discussing whatever men of this period discussed when the women had momentarily stepped away, a division that was loosening through the 1950s compared to earlier decades, but had by no means disappeared, particularly among the more traditionally minded households in any given circle. Departure, too, followed its own quiet rule. A guest who left too early risked seeming to have had a poor time, A guest who lingered too long past what the evening's natural rhythm suggested risked overstaying a welcome that the hostess, exhausted after hours of vigilant performance, was by then very much ready to see end, even while continuing, to the very last goodbye at the door, to insist warmly that everyone really must come again soon. Sunday morning arrives with its own fixed shape, different in texture from every other day of the week, because Sunday combined the heaviest concentration of public visibility. An entire congregation gathered in one place, dressed in their very best, with the lightest actual workload, since cooking had largely been done the day before specifically to keep Sunday itself as free as possible for rest and worship. Getting the family out the door on time for the 9 o'clock service was its own small military operation. A husband in his good suit, children scrubbed and dressed and warned repeatedly about the specific consequences of fidgeting during the sermon, and the woman herself in what amounted to the single most carefully considered outfit of her entire week, since church, more than any other gathering, placed every woman present under the simultaneous, friendly, relentless evaluation of the entire female community at once, rather than the smaller subset you might see at a given coffee morning or bridge table. The service itself I will not dwell on at length, since the religious content of a Sunday morning in 1954 varied enormously by denomination and by individual congregation, and the etiquette governing it, sit quietly, follow along, rise and sit at the correct moments, was largely the same etiquette of public decorum that governed any formal gathering of the period. What I want to spend real time on instead is what happened afterward, on the church steps, in the 10 or 15 minutes of sunlit conversation that followed the service, because this brief window functioned as one of the single most socially significant moments of the entire week, more concentrated in its way than even the dinner party, because here the entire visible community gathered at once in one place on one set of stone steps, under one sun, and every woman present could see in a single glance exactly how every other woman present looked, who she was speaking with, how warmly, for how long. The conversations themselves on those steps tended to be brief, often no more than 2 or 3 minutes per exchange, a woman moving through a small constellation of acquaintances in the time available, exchanging pleasantries, perhaps confirming a coffee date for the coming week, perhaps simply trading a few words about the sermon or the unusually fine weather. But the choreography of who spoke to whom, for how long, with what evident warmth, was read by everyone present with the same careful attention a person today might pay to a social media feed, registering who seemed to be thriving this particular week and who seemed, by some subtle deficit of attention from the group, to be drifting slightly toward the edges. A woman who found herself standing alone for more than a minute or two, while clusters of conversation animated the steps around her, felt that isolation acutely, even while every other woman present would have insisted, if asked, that nobody here ever intentionally excluded anybody. This is the moment in the week, I think, where the whole apparatus we have been walking through tonight reveals itself most plainly, all at once in bright daylight rather than behind closed doors. The coffee mornings, the calling visits, the borrowed sugar and returned pie dishes, the bridge club's careful hierarchy, the dinner party's elaborate choreography of compliments deflected and seating arrangements calculated, all of it converges here, on a set of church steps on a Sunday morning, into a single, continuously updating, collectively maintained social ledger that every woman present both contributed to and was, simultaneously being measured against. Nobody had designed this system. Nobody could point to a single founding document or a single meeting where these rules had been agreed upon, and yet it ran with a precision and a consistency that any deliberately engineered institution might envy, sustained entirely by the accumulated, inherited, half-conscious agreement of thousands of women across thousands of streets just like this one, all across the country, in roughly the same years, building essentially from scratch the social infrastructure of an entirely new kind of American neighborhood. There is another instrument in all of this that deserves its own attention, one that has not come up yet tonight, and that is the telephone. which by 1954 had become, for women like the one we are spending this evening with, something close to the nervous system of the entire social structure we have been describing. The telephone itself sat in a specific location in most of these homes, often a small table in the front hallway, sometimes in the kitchen, rarely in a bedroom, and its placement was not incidental, since a phone call, like a visit, was understood as a social event with its own rules of conduct, and a properly run household kept its telephone somewhere a woman could answer it promptly and speak from it with appropriate poise, rather than sprawled across a bed in the privacy a later generation would take for granted. The etiquette of telephone calls among neighborhood women followed conventions that, again, nobody had ever written down in any single place she could consult, and yet everybody seemed to absorb without difficulty. Calls were generally not placed before 9 in the morning, on the assumption that a household might still be in the midst of its earliest, least presentable routines, nor after 9 in the evening, when families were assumed to be settling toward bed. A call that ran long, beyond perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, for an ordinary social chat, risked the faint accusation of monopolizing a shared resource, since many households of this period still operated on a party line, a single telephone circuit shared among several neighboring households, meaning that a woman deep in conversation with one neighbor was, quite literally, occupying a line that another neighbor down the street might urgently need for an actual emergency, and the etiquette of yielding a party line promptly when another household needed it carried its own small, specific code of courtesy, including the genuinely delicate question of what a woman was and was not permitted to overhear if she happened to pick up her own receiver and find another conversation already in progress on the shared line, a circumstance that, depending entirely on who was speaking and what was being discussed, could either be discreetly and silently set back down, or, in a temptation that more than a few women apparently found impossible to resist, lingered over for just a moment longer than strict etiquette technically allowed. The telephone also served as the primary instrument through which the actual machinery of invitations and arrangements operated beneath the more formal, written invitations reserved for events like the Hendersons' dinner party. A coffee morning, more often than not, was arranged by phone, a quick call from the week's hostess confirming who would be attending, sometimes the night before, sometimes that very morning, and the speed and warmth with which a woman returned such a call, or the speed with which she herself extended one, fed directly back into the same web of impressions and judgments running underneath every other interaction in this world. A woman who let a phone call go unreturned for 2 or 3 days, even an entirely casual one, risked the same small, quiet erosion of standing that a slow returned visit risked, the accumulation of tiny signals that, individually meant almost nothing, but that, gathered together over months, formed the actual texture of how warmly or coolly a given household was regarded by everyone around it. I find myself thinking, telling you all of this about just how much cognitive and emotional bandwidth an ordinary week required of these women, bandwidth that the culture around them insisted, constantly and cheerfully, was not really labor at all. Tracking calls owed and calls paid, tracking borrowed items and their return, calculating, without ever discussing it directly, where a dozen different households sat relative to one another on an invisible ladder built from husbands' salaries, managing the precise emotional temperature of a dinner party for 3 uninterrupted hours, performing almost continuously an appearance of effortless warmth and contentment regardless of what actually sat underneath it on any given day. None of this had a job title. None of it appeared on a tax form or a census category, and all of it, every single week, every single year, across millions of households just like this one, kept an entire vast and genuinely new social experiment, the American suburb, running smoothly enough that its inhabitants could plausibly believe, most of the time, that it was running by itself. Let us go back for a moment to the question of clothing, because I think it deserves a slower, closer look than we gave it earlier this evening, and there is something genuinely worth sitting with in just how physically demanding the standard of a properly put-together woman actually was in 1954. demanding in a literal bodily sense that goes well beyond the question of which dress to choose for which occasion. Underneath the dress itself sat an entire architecture of foundation garments that a woman of this period, particularly a woman attending to any social occasion more formal than her own kitchen on washing day, was expected to wear as a matter of basic presentability. A girdle, typically a heavy elasticized garment worn around the midsection and hips, designed to smooth and compress the body into the narrower, more controlled silhouette that the fashion of the period favoured, regardless of a woman's actual figure underneath it. Stockings, held up by garters attached to the girdle itself, since pantyhose as we know them today would not become widely available for roughly another decade, meaning a woman's legs were sheathed every single day she left the house in nylon stockings that were themselves a small daily exercise in vigilance, since a single snag against a rough chair edge or a careless fingernail could run the entire stocking instantly, a genuine minor crisis given that stockings were not inexpensive and a spare pair was not always on hand. A brassiere constructed along the structured pointed lines the period's fashion favoured. Sometimes, depending on the dress and the occasion, a separate waist cincher layered on top of or instead of the girdle, for an even more dramatically narrowed silhouette. All of this, understand, before a single visible item of clothing went on. A woman dressing for an ordinary Tuesday coffee morning was, by the time she stood fully dressed in front of her mirror, wearing several distinct, structured, often genuinely uncomfortable garments, layered carefully according to an order she had performed so many times it required no conscious thought, and doing all of this not for some special occasion but simply to leave her own house and walk 3 doors down for an hour of coffee with women she saw, in many cases, multiple times a week. The discomfort involved was real and it was rarely discussed, partly because discomfort, like so much else in this world, was simply assumed to be the unremarkable cost of looking properly put together, a cost every woman paid and therefore a cost nobody felt entitled to complain about, the same way nobody complains today about a seatbelt being slightly uncomfortable, because the discomfort is simply the accepted price of the thing it makes possible. The hair and makeup routine carried its own specific daily rhythm, distinct from the more elaborate version reserved for the beauty parlour visit every other week. A woman typically slept with her hair set in pin curls or rollers, a genuinely uncomfortable nightly ritual that she had, by this point in her life, learnt to sleep through almost entirely, the small hard curlers pressing against the pillow in a pattern her body had simply adapted to over years of repetition. Each morning, before anything else, before even the coffee was made in some households, the curlers came out, the hair brushed and shaped into the smooth, controlled style the period favoured, and a light application of lipstick and powder followed, even on a day with no callers expected, even on washing day itself, because the rule, as we discussed earlier, did not actually distinguish between days when a woman expected to be seen and days when she did not, on the theory that a husband arriving home unexpectedly or a neighbour appearing at the door without warning could occur at any hour, and a woman caught looking, in the language of the period, like death warmed over, carried a small specific shame that the daily ritual existed entirely to prevent. I want to pause here and notice something, because I think it is easy telling this story to make it sound purely punishing, a long list of physical discomforts imposed on women for no reason beyond an arbitrary and rather cruel set of expectations, and there is real truth in that reading, but there is also, I think, something more layered going on. Because for a great many of these women, this same daily ritual, the girdle, the stockings, the lipstick applied before the coffee was even poured, also functioned as a genuine source of pride and identity, a daily act of self-respect performed specifically because it was difficult, because it required real discipline to maintain day after day with nobody necessarily watching or rewarding it in any concrete way. A woman who kept up this standard even alone in her own kitchen, even on the most exhausting days of early motherhood, experienced that discipline, at least some of the time, as a genuine accomplishment rather than only a burden, evidence that she had not let circumstance defeat her, that she remained in her own private accounting a woman who had her standards and met them. Both things were true simultaneously, the burden and the pride, the discomfort and the dignity, And I think the era gets misunderstood whenever we try to collapse it down into only one of those two truths, when the actual lived experience for most women, most days, sat somewhere genuinely tangled between them, beyond Dorothy Draper and the steady monthly drumbeat of the Ladies' Home Journal. An entire small industry of etiquette authorities had grown up to serve exactly this audience, and it is worth naming a few more of them because their books sat, quite literally, on the shelf of a great many homes just like the one we are visiting tonight, consulted the way a person today might consult a search engine for quick, specific, authoritative answers to questions that felt, in the moment, surprisingly urgent. Emily Post's original etiquette guide, first published back in the 1920s, had gone through edition after edition by the 1950s, each revision softening some of its more rigid Victorian inheritance while preserving the basic architecture of the thing, a comprehensive, almost legalistic accounting of correct behavior across every imaginable social situation. Who is introduced to whom first, how a place setting should be arranged, what a properly worded invitation should say, and how promptly it required a response. Amy Vanderbilt published her own complete book of etiquette in the early 1950s specifically, and it became almost immediately one of the standard references of the decade, written in a voice slightly more attuned to the realities of post-war suburban life than Post's more aristocratic original had been, addressing directly the kinds of questions a woman like ours might actually have, the correct way to handle a coffee morning, the correct etiquette for a young couple just starting out in a first home with a more modest budget than their parents' generation might have commanded. What strikes me most looking back at these books now is not really any individual rule they contained, most of which read today as charmingly antiquated at best and faintly absurd at worst. What strikes me is the sheer comprehensiveness of the ambition behind them, the implicit promise that if a woman simply read carefully enough and followed closely enough, she could achieve something close to social safety, a guarantee that she would never again find herself uncertain, exposed, caught out by a situation she did not know how to handle. That promise, of course, could never actually be kept, because social life, then as now, kept generating genuinely novel situations no manual had anticipated, a hostess gift that turned out to duplicate another guest's, a borrowed dish broken in transit, a neighbor's child who said something genuinely awkward at exactly the wrong moment. But the promise itself, the idea that mastery was achievable, that there existed a finite, learnable set of correct answers, offered something genuinely comforting to women navigating an entirely new kind of social landscape with no inherited tradition to draw on. And I think that comfort, more than any specific rule inside these books, explains why they sold as well as they did, copy after copy, household after household, across a country rapidly filling up with brand new neighborhoods that needed, almost desperately, some kind of shared script to follow. Children, too, played their own quiet but genuinely significant role in all of this social calculus, in ways that extended well beyond simple matters of behavior at the table. A woman standing among her neighbors was affected, often more than she might have liked to admit, by how her children performed in the small, constant, informal evaluations that happened every time the neighborhood's children played together in somebody's yard. A child who hit, who took toys without asking, who threw a genuine tantrum within earshot of other mothers, reflected back on his own mother in a way that felt to her deeply personal, even when the misbehavior in question was nothing more than entirely ordinary childhood conduct that any honest adult, given a moment's reflection, would recognize as developmentally unremarkable. The pressure this created ran in both directions, mothers anxiously monitoring their own children's behavior in front of other mothers, and mothers, sometimes despite their best intentions, quietly judging other women's children, and by extension other women's mothering, based on a single afternoon's worth of evidence gathered while the children themselves were simply being children, the way children of any era inevitably are. There is something I find genuinely poignant in this particular thread, because it adds an entire additional category of invisible labor onto a week already saturated with it. The management not only of one's own appearance, one's own conversation, one's own household, but the ongoing, largely unconscious management of small children whose behavior could not, by the nature of small children, ever be fully controlled, and yet whose behavior was nonetheless quietly understood as a direct reflection of their mother's competence and character. A woman could keep her own dress perfectly pressed, her own conversation carefully steered away from every forbidden topic, her own house spotless behind every closed door, and still find her careful social standing genuinely shaken by a 4-year-old's poorly timed tantrum at somebody else's birthday party, a piece of the system entirely outside her control, and yet attributed, almost automatically, to a failure that was hers alone. Let me tell you about a woman, and I should say up front that she is not any single real person whose name survives in any historical record, but a composite built from the kinds of stories that show up again and again in the oral histories and later interviews collected from women who lived through exactly this period. The kind of story that every woman on a street like this one would have known in some version about somebody somewhere nearby. Call her for tonight Marjorie, though that is simply a name I am choosing to give a shape to a pattern rather than a record of an actual person. Marjorie moved into a subdivision very much like this one in the early 1950s. Young, newly married, eager, by every account that survives in the genre of story this represents, to do everything correctly, and for the better part of a year she did. She returned calls within the proper window. She hosted her turn at coffee with appropriate care. She brought a properly considered gift to every dinner party she attended. And then, at one particular gathering, an evening that probably felt, walking into it like any other evening on the calendar, she made what amounted by any reasonable modern standard to an almost invisible mistake. She mentioned in passing during a conversation that had drifted, without her quite noticing the drift, toward the subject of household budgets, that she and her husband had recently had to put off buying a new washing machine for another year, that the one they had was getting old and unreliable, but that, given everything else, it would simply have to do for now. This was not by any objective measure a scandalous thing to say. It was, if anything, an entirely ordinary admission, the kind of small financial honesty that almost every household on that street was quietly managing in some form or another, since not every family on a brand new subdivision street was equally flush despite the uniform houses suggesting otherwise. But it broke, plainly and unmistakably, the great unspoken rule against discussing money directly, and worse, it revealed a specific financial limitation rather than simply gesturing vaguely at the universal, shared, comfortable middle-class condition that the entire social fiction of the neighborhood depended on everyone projecting. The room, by the account this kind of story always preserves, did not erupt into visible judgment. Nobody said a single unkind word. The conversation simply moved on, smoothly, to another topic, the way these conversations always moved smoothly past anything uncomfortable. But something had shifted, and Marjorie, in the weeks that followed, began to notice it in exactly the small, deniable ways the entire system specialized in. An invitation that usually arrived by Wednesday for the following week's coffee arrived, this particular week, on Friday instead, and felt somehow slightly less warm in its phrasing. A bridge invitation that she had expected given her usual place in the rotation simply did not come that month, and when she mentioned it lightly to another woman, the explanation offered was vague, something about the numbers not quite working out this time, an explanation that satisfied nobody, least of all Marjorie, but that could not be challenged without seeming itself somehow paranoid or difficult. Nothing had been announced, no formal exclusion had occurred, and yet over the following months Marjorie found herself drifting, slowly and almost imperceptibly, from the warm centre of her neighbourhood's social life toward its quieter, cooler edges, invited still to the largest, most inclusive gatherings, the kind that practically everyone on the street attended, but no longer quite trusted with the smaller, closer, more selective ones that actually constituted real social belonging in this world. I tell you this story not because it is dramatic, because by any standard of real human cruelty it is almost shockingly mild. A few missed invitations, a slightly cooler tone in a few phone calls, nothing that any single woman involved would likely have described, if pressed, as deliberate punishment. And that, I think, is exactly the point worth sitting with. The system did not require cruelty to function. It required only a kind of collective, half-conscious vigilance, every woman quietly recalibrating her warmth toward every other woman, based on a constant stream of small signals, financial admissions, social slights, missed returned visits, unreturned phone calls, none of it ever rising to the level of an actual confrontation, all of it nonetheless adding up, slowly and invisibly, into consequences that could genuinely last for years. Marjorie, in the version of this story passed down, eventually found a different, smaller circle of friends, women slightly outside the dominant rotation, women who had themselves drifted to the edges for their own small, unspoken reasons, and built a quieter, more honest version of community there, on the margins, away from the relentless performance the central circle demanded. It worked out in its way, but it took years to happen, and it began with a single sentence about a washing machine, spoken at a dinner party, by a woman who had no idea in the moment she said it that she had broken any rule at all. It is worth saying, too, that this entire world looked slightly different depending on where in the country you happened to be standing, because the suburb of 1954 was not actually a single uniform thing, despite how thoroughly the popular imagination has flattened it into one image, one street, one kind of house. The original Levittown sat on Long Island, within a reasonable train ride of New York City, and the women living there carried with them, often, a slightly different inherited social vocabulary than the women settling new subdivisions outside Detroit, or Chicago, or the rapidly expanding suburbs of Southern California, where an entirely different climate, an entirely different relationship to the automobile, and an entirely different mix of regional backgrounds among the new arrivals produced its own distinct local variations on the basic rules we have been walking through tonight. A subdivision outside Los Angeles, for instance, tended to develop a social calendar built more thoroughly around the patio and the swimming pool than around the more enclosed indoor coffee morning that dominated in colder climates, the mild year-round weather permitting a kind of outdoor entertaining that simply was not practical for months at a stretch in a Chicago winter. The specific ethnic and religious makeup of a given subdivision mattered enormously too, since the same broad social structure, the calling visits, the coffee rotations, the bridge clubs, absorbed real variation depending on whether a given street was predominantly Protestant or heavily Catholic or, in certain pockets, predominantly Jewish, each community layering its own specific customs, its own specific holidays and observances, its own specific inherited etiquette onto the basic suburban template everyone was, in some sense, building together for the first time. And of course, as I mentioned earlier this evening, and as I do not want to let slip entirely out of frame even while we spend most of our time tonight inside this one household's particular week, the entire phenomenon we are describing existed almost exclusively within white, middle-class America, by design rather than by accident. The explicit and deliberate exclusion of black families from the financing and deed restrictions that built places like Levittown, meaning that an entirely different, separately constructed black middle-class suburban experience was unfolding during these same years, in different towns under different but in some ways strikingly parallel social pressures, its own etiquette, its own churches, its own card clubs and social calendars, documented far less thoroughly in the historical records, specifically because the magazines and etiquette manuals selling advice to suburban housewives in this period were, with vanishingly rare exception, writing for and about white women exclusively, treating their experience as simply the universal American experience rather than one particular racially bounded version of it. I raise this again not to derail the story we are following tonight, but because I think it would be a kind of quiet dishonesty to let an entire hour pass without acknowledging it more than once, that the world we are moving through, with all its small rules and small cruelties and small genuine warmths, was a world built quite deliberately to include some American families and exclude others, and that the very houses, the very streets, the very calendar of coffee mornings and bridge clubs we have spent tonight inside, sat on a foundation of policy choices that we are still, in many real ways, living with the consequences of today. Let us come back now to Sunday evening and slow all the way down, because I think after everything we have walked through tonight, the structure and the rules and the hierarchy and the quiet costs of all of it, it is worth simply sitting for a while inside the actual texture of an ordinary evening in this house. The kind of evening that made up the overwhelming majority of this woman's life, far more of it than the dinner parties and the bridge nights that tend to dominate any account like the one I have been giving you. The light outside has gone the particular gold colour it goes in late spring, around 7 in the evening, slanting low through the kitchen window and catching the rim of a glass left on the counter, the dust mote suspended in it almost visible if you happen to be looking at exactly the right angle. Dinner has been cleared. Her husband sits in the front room with the newspaper, or perhaps, since the television set has by this point become a fixture in a great many homes on this street, watching something on the small black and white screen that throws its own flickering, slightly blue light across the room as the evening deepens outside. Her son is in bed finally after the particular nightly negotiation that putting a small child to bed always seems to require. One more story, one more glass of water, the soft protests gradually thinning out into the even, untroubled breathing of actual sleep. She is at the sink finishing the last of the dishes, and there is a particular quality to this specific task performed at this specific hour that I think deserves a moment of real attention, because it sits at the very edge of the day's structure, the last obligation before whatever passes in this life for her own time. The water is warm, not hot, just warm enough to cut through the grease left by the evening's roast, and the smell of the dish soap, a specific floral chemical scent that this brand and this era favoured, mixes faintly with the lingering smell of the meal itself, still hanging in the kitchen air. Her hands move through a sequence so practiced it requires almost no conscious attention at all. Plate, rinse, rack, plate, rinse, rack, and her mind, freed by the sheer repetition of the task, wanders somewhere else entirely, back over the week that is now, with this Sunday evening, finally closing. She thinks briefly about Marjorie, though of course not by that name, since Marjorie's story as I told it to you tonight is itself a composite, drawn from many such women rather than a specific neighbour of this specific woman. But there is, on every street like this one, somebody like Marjorie, somebody who slipped somehow from the warm centre toward the cooler edge, and every other woman on the street carries that story somewhere in the back of her mind, not maliciously, simply as data, as a kind of cautionary outline that quietly informs how carefully she herself moves through her own week. She thinks about the dinner party last night, replaying the way you replay these things, a single moment where she is fairly sure she said something slightly wrong, nothing catastrophic, simply a comment about the Hendersons' new car that came out, in retrospect, sounding more pointed than she had intended it, and she turns this over now, at the sink, with the particular mild anxious energy that follows you home from any evening spent performing for several consecutive hours, wondering whether anyone else even noticed, wondering whether she is wondering about nothing at all. And there is something else too, something quieter, sitting underneath the specific worry about the comment at dinner, something closer to simple tiredness, the bone-deep kind that does not come from any single hard task but from the accumulated weight of an entire week spent calibrating, performing, tracking, managing, a tiredness that she does not really have a name for, and would not, if asked directly by her own husband sitting 20 feet away with his newspaper, know quite how to explain in a way that would not sound, to her own ears, like complaining about a life that she has been told, from every direction available to her, is the very best life a woman in her position could possibly hope for. The last dish goes into the rack. She dries her hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle, and for just a moment, standing alone at the sink with the kitchen finally quiet except for the faint murmur of the television from the other room, she allows herself something she would never quite name out loud, not even to herself in plain words, a small private space where none of the rules of the week actually apply, where nobody is watching her expression, calculating her tone, measuring her against any ladder at all. It does not last long. It is not meant to last long. In a few minutes she will go and sit with her husband, ask him something about his day, settle into the last hour before bed in the particular comfortable, familiar silence of two people who have built a life together, even if neither of them has ever quite said everything there might be to say. But for this one moment at the sink drying her hands, she is simply a person, tired, a little anxious about a comment from the night before, fond of her husband in the next room, fond of her sleeping son down the hall, uncertain about a great many things and certain about a few others. And that, more than any rule we have discussed tonight, more than any coffee morning or bridge club or careful hierarchy of husbands' salaries, is probably the truest thing I can tell you about who she actually was. It is worth, before we drift any further into the quiet of this particular evening, taking a moment to look forward briefly at what eventually happened to this entire elaborate structure, because nothing about it, however permanent it must have felt living inside it in 1954, turned out to be permanent at all. The system we have spent tonight walking through reached something close to its fullest, most rigid expression in the years right around this one, the early to middle 1950s, a moment when the suburbs themselves were still new enough that their social customs carried real urgency, real stakes for the women building them. But the cracks, even at this moment, were already there, quietly waiting. Betty Friedan's interviews, which would eventually become her book, were still several years away from publication, but the dissatisfaction she would later document was already present in the women she eventually spoke to, sitting underneath lives that in 1954 looked from the outside like nothing but contentment. By the early 1960s, that dissatisfaction had found its name, and its name, once spoken aloud in a best-selling book that an enormous number of suburban women actually read, sometimes secretly, sometimes passing a single dog-eared copy quietly from house to house, began to do something the etiquette manuals had never anticipated. It gave women permission to ask out loud, finally, whether the entire structure was actually worth what it cost them. The 1960s brought other pressures to bear on this world as well, pressures that had little directly to do with suburban etiquette, but that nonetheless reshaped the ground it stood on. The civil rights movement, gathering force through the decade, eventually forced open at least some of the legal mechanisms that had kept neighborhoods like this one racially exclusive, though the deeper economic consequences of decades of exclusion would prove far harder to undo than the laws themselves. The slow but real increase in women working outside the home, already underway in the 1950s despite how thoroughly the culture's own self-image ignored it, accelerated through the following 2 decades, and a woman who spent 8 hours a day at an office or a classroom simply did not have the same available bandwidth for an elaborate, constantly maintained calendar of coffee mornings and calling visits that a woman entirely at home had once sustained, almost by necessity, the rules themselves bending and loosening as the actual conditions of women's daily lives shifted underneath them. By the 1970s, a great deal of what we have spent tonight describing had simply faded, not through any single dramatic rejection, but through the slow, cumulative effect of changed circumstances. Fewer women home all day to maintain the elaborate calendar, a broader cultural permission to speak more plainly about money and dissatisfaction and the genuine difficulty of domestic life. A younger generation of women who had grown up watching their own mothers perform exactly this kind of constant, exhausting social vigilance, and who wanted, for reasons that felt to them entirely self-evident, something different and considerably less demanding for themselves. The white gloves disappeared from ordinary daily errands first, then the calling cards, then gradually the more rigid versions of the coffee morning and bridge club rotation, replaced by looser, less codified, less hierarchical forms of neighborhood friendship that, whatever they lost in structure and reliability, gained in something closer to honesty. I do not think it is quite right to tell this part of the story as a simple, uncomplicated story of liberation, though there is real truth in that framing too. Something genuine was also lost in the unraveling of this world, a level of reliable, structured, face-to-face neighborhood connection that a great many later generations of American suburbanites, isolated in their own separate houses with considerably less regular contact between them, would come to miss, even while understanding perfectly well why the earlier system could not and should not have survived intact. The women of 1954 were not simply waiting to be liberated from a system they secretly hated every single moment of. They were living inside something genuinely complicated, structure and constraint braided together so tightly that pulling the constraint free meant losing some of the structure too. And what came after, the more individualized, more honest, considerably less surveilled suburban life of later decades, brought its own losses alongside its real and substantial gains. Let me take you back, for a little while longer, into the kitchen itself, because I think we have talked around it all evening without ever quite stopping to really look at it. And the kitchen, more than almost any other room in a house like this one, sat at the absolute centre of how 1954 understood what a woman's life was actually for. The kitchen our woman cooks in tonight is, by any honest historical comparison, a genuinely remarkable space. A space her own mother, cooking in a much older house with a much older arrangement of icebox and wood stove and no real counter space to speak of, would have found almost unimaginably convenient. The refrigerator hums quietly along one wall, white enamel, rounded corners in the streamlined style the period favoured. Its freezer compartment, however small by later standards, representing a genuine revolution in how a family could plan and store food across an entire week rather than shopping, as her mother once had, almost daily for whatever could be kept fresh only a day or two at most. The stove beside it runs on gas, with 4 burners and an oven large enough to roast a proper Sunday dinner, and along the counters sit the smaller machines that, taken together, constituted an entire new category of consumer good that simply had not existed in anything like this form a generation earlier. A toaster that popped the bread up automatically rather than requiring constant watching. A mixer that could whip batter in a fraction of the time a hand whisk once required. And, increasingly common by the middle of the decade, the beginnings of what would soon become an entire genre of specialized kitchen gadgetry, marketed directly and relentlessly to exactly the woman standing in this kitchen tonight. This is worth sitting with. The sheer scale of the advertising apparatus that had grown up specifically to sell appliances and household goods into homes like this one. Magazine advertisements, radio spots, and increasingly by 1954 television commercials, poured a constant stream of messaging into American homes promising that the correct purchase, this particular detergent, this particular wax, this particular gleaming new range, would deliver not merely a cleaner floor or a faster dinner, but something considerably larger and vaguer: a happier husband, a more secure marriage, a more genuine sense of having arrived at the good life the whole culture kept describing. The woman in this kitchen tonight has absorbed an enormous amount of this messaging across years of magazine reading and radio listening, and the occasional evening spent in front of the television, and it would be a mistake to imagine her as some passive vessel simply swallowing it whole, since most women of this period held a far more skeptical, knowing relationship with advertising than the advertisements themselves ever quite gave them credit for. Understanding perfectly well that the gleaming floor in the commercial would not actually stay gleaming in her own real kitchen, the way it did in 30 seconds of carefully lit film, and yet the messaging worked anyway, in the sense that it shaped gradually and cumulatively what counted as an acceptable standard for an ordinary kitchen, an ordinary meal, an ordinary household. This is also, I should mention, the period when something called the Tupperware party first began spreading rapidly across exactly this kind of suburban landscape. A sales structure invented by a woman named Brownie Wise, who had discovered that a plastic food storage product nobody much understood how to sell in ordinary stores could be sold remarkably well through a different mechanism entirely. A hostess inviting a group of neighborhood women into her own living room for an afternoon, demonstrating the product's surprising airtight seal with a small flourish, the famous burping sound a properly sealed container made when you press the air out before closing the lid, and then taking orders directly, with the hostess herself earning a small commission or a free product in exchange for opening her home. This turned out to be a genuinely brilliant adaptation to exactly the social world we have spent this entire evening describing, since it required no separate trip to a store, fit naturally into the existing rhythm of coffee mornings and afternoon visiting that already structured these women's weeks, and offered, alongside the products themselves, a small taste of something close to commercial independence, a hostess earning her own modest income, in her own name, through her own social network, in an era when very few other avenues for a woman's independent earning existed at all within the bounds of what suburban respectability still considered acceptable. I find that detail genuinely worth pausing on, because it suggests something true about how resourceful women of this period actually were, even operating entirely within a system designed in so many ways to keep them financially dependent and socially contained. The same dense, intricate web of coffee mornings and neighborhood visiting that enforced such rigid conformity in matters of dress and conversation and reputation also turned out to be exactly the infrastructure a clever saleswoman could repurpose into something closer to genuine female economic activity, modest, constrained, entirely unrecognized by any official statistic of the period, and real nonetheless. I want to say something now about the particular season we are actually sitting inside tonight, because I mentioned it only in passing earlier and it deserves more than that. Spring and early summer in a town like this one carried its own distinct rhythm within the broader yearly calendar of suburban social life, what the women themselves, in the language of the period, sometimes simply called the season, though it meant something considerably more modest here than the word once meant among the wealthy debutante circles that had originally coined it. Through the winter months, the coffee mornings and bridge clubs had continued, of course, but largely indoors, contained the deep cold discouraging much beyond the absolute necessities of calling and visiting. Spring changed the texture of the entire calendar almost overnight. The first genuinely warm Saturday of the year tended to bring out an entirely different category of gathering, the backyard cookout, newly possible thanks to the spread of the outdoor charcoal grill, itself a fairly recent consumer innovation that husbands had taken to with a particular, almost ceremonial enthusiasm, since cooking outdoors over a fire occupied a strange but comfortable middle ground in the period's gender logic, a kind of cooking that, unlike anything happening inside the kitchen, was understood as entirely appropriate, even admirable, for a man to perform in front of an audience of neighbors. Garden parties began appearing on the calendar too, smaller and more modest than the word might suggest. An afternoon gathering in somebody's backyard, lemonade and finger sandwiches set out on a folding table, the neighborhood's children let loose to run across several connected lawns, while their mothers sat in lawn chairs and continued, in a slightly more relaxed outdoor register, the same careful conversational choreography that governed every other gathering on the calendar. The 4th of July, arriving at the peak of this season, brought the entire neighborhood together in a way few other occasions managed, a genuinely communal celebration that briefly suspended some of the more rigid social distinctions running underneath every other gathering, since a block party spanning an entire street, with every household contributing something to a shared table of food, operated on a logic of collective abundance rather than the more carefully calibrated reciprocity that governed smaller, more selective gatherings throughout the rest of the year. Children ran sparklers across darkening lawns as the light faded. Husbands gathered near the grills, beer in hand, in a loose, easy camaraderie that mirrored, in its own masculine register, the same social bonding the women achieved through coffee and cards. And for one evening at least, something close to genuine, uncalculated community seemed to settle over the whole street. The hierarchy and the careful etiquette still present underneath, certainly, but loosened for these few hours by the simple, shared pleasure of warm weather and good food, and the particular American pageantry of a summer evening built around fireworks and flags. This is the season, then, that our week tonight sits inside, the social calendar at its fullest and most active stretch of the entire year. The coffee mornings slightly more frequent now that the weather permits an easy walk between houses, the dinner parties moving as the summer deepens, increasingly out onto patios and into backyards, the whole rhythm of the neighborhood quickening into something that, for these few warm months, comes closer than at any other point in the calendar to the genuinely connected, genuinely vibrant community the magazines were always describing, even while the underlying rules, the hierarchy, the careful avoidance of anything too honest, the constant low hum of evaluation running beneath every gathering, never actually went anywhere at all. Let us return for a little while to the marriage itself, because everything we have discussed tonight, the coffee mornings and the bridge clubs and the careful hierarchy of husbands' salaries, existed in service of something, ultimately, and that something was the marriage at the center of each of these households. The institution every other piece of this social architecture was quietly, constantly working to protect and sustain. The Ladies' Home Journal column I mentioned earlier, Can This Marriage Be Saved?, deserves a closer look here because it ran continuously for decades, written initially under the byline of a marriage counselor named Paul Popenoe, who had built an entire professional reputation around something he called family relations, an early and influential version of what we would now simply call marriage counseling. Each installment presented a real or composited case, a marriage in genuine difficulty, infidelity, drinking, financial strain, a husband and wife who had simply stopped speaking honestly to one another somewhere along the way, and walked the reader through Popenoe's diagnosis and recommended course of correction, almost always concluding, in the overwhelming majority of installments across the column's long run, that the marriage could indeed be saved, and specifically that it could be saved through some combination of better communication, renewed effort, and, very often, some adjustment on the wife's part to better accommodate her husband's needs and moods. I find this column genuinely fascinating to read now, decades later, because it offers something the etiquette manuals, with their relentless focus on table settings and proper calling hours, almost never provided: a direct, if heavily filtered, window into the actual private troubles sitting underneath the polished surface of suburban marriage in this period. Readers wrote in by the thousands describing real anguish, real loneliness, husbands who had grown distant, wives who felt invisible inside their own homes, and the column's enormous sustained popularity across so many years suggests something important, that an enormous number of women reading it recognized, in these case studies, something true about their own lives, even while the public performance of contentment we have spent tonight describing required them to keep that recognition almost entirely private, shared only through the relatively safe anonymous mechanism of a magazine letter, rather than admitted aloud to an actual neighbor over coffee. The advice itself, read today, carries a particular flavor that tells you a great deal about what the period expected of a wife specifically, as distinct from a husband. A wife was very often counseled toward patience, toward adjusting her own behavior and expectations, toward finding ways to make herself more attractive, more accommodating, more attentive to her husband's moods and needs, a recommendation that, however well-intentioned the underlying counseling philosophy may genuinely have been, placed the bulk of the emotional labor of repairing a struggling marriage squarely on the wife's side of the ledger. The same emotional labor we discussed earlier tonight in the context of the dinner party hostess managing a room, now extended into the much higher stakes territory of an actual marriage in genuine trouble. A husband's own contribution to whatever had gone wrong received attention too. Certainly, the column was not entirely one-sided, but the practical, day-to-day burden of actually fixing things, the concrete behavioral changes the column most often recommended, tended to land again and again in the wife's hands. I do not think this reflects any particular cruelty on the part of the people writing this advice, who were, by most accounts, genuinely trying to help real couples in real distress using the best understanding of marriage and psychology available to them at the time. I think it reflects instead simply how thoroughly the entire surrounding culture had already decided, before any individual marriage counselor ever sat down to write a single column, that a wife's role included responsibility for the emotional temperature of the household, in sickness as in health, in crisis as in ordinary daily life, and a marriage counseling column operating inside that culture could hardly have arrived at a fundamentally different distribution of responsibility. However much its individual authors might genuinely have wanted to help both halves of a struggling couple equally, much of what we actually know now about the private interior of these women's lives, as opposed to the public performance the magazines and etiquette manuals describe so thoroughly, comes from sources that took decades to surface, which is itself worth pausing on for a moment. Diaries kept quietly through these years, never intended for any reader beyond their author, occasionally surfaced later, passed down to daughters or granddaughters who recognized, reading them, a voice considerably more complicated and more honest than the smiling, contented image of the era they had absorbed from television reruns and nostalgic magazine retrospectives. Oral History Project, beginning in earnest in the 1970s and continuing through the decades since, sat down with women who had actually lived through exactly the kind of week we have spent tonight walking through, and asked them, often for the very first time in their lives, to describe what it had actually felt like, rather than what it had been supposed to look like. What emerges from these later interviews is, almost without exception, more textured and more genuinely mixed than either the nostalgic version of the decade or the purely critical version manages to capture on its own. Women recalled real friendships from the coffee circuit and bridge club, friendships that, despite the careful constraints on what could be honestly discussed, nonetheless sustained them through genuinely difficult stretches of early marriage and motherhood. Women who showed up with a casserole when a baby was sick, who sat for an afternoon when a husband had been laid off and nobody quite knew what to say about it, but somebody needed to simply be present anyway. They also recalled, with a startling consistency across interviews conducted decades apart, and across women who had never met one another, the same specific feeling we discussed earlier tonight, the sense of being surrounded by people and somehow still profoundly alone, unable to say the actual truth of a difficult week to anyone, including in many cases their own husbands, who had been raised within their own version of the same cultural expectation that a man did not discuss feelings, certainly not financial anxiety or marital doubt, or the specific exhaustion of fatherhood, beyond the most surface acknowledgement that work had been difficult that day. I think what strikes me most reading through this later testimony is how many of these women, looking back from a distance of 20 or 30 or 40 years, arrived at a similar kind of nuanced, doubled judgment about their own younger selves and the world that younger self had inhabited. They did not, most of them, simply condemn the 1950s suburb as a prison they had been trapped inside, the easy narrative a later, more openly critical era sometimes wanted to impose backward onto their experience. But they also did not, most of them, simply defend it as the unambiguous golden age that nostalgia television and magazine retrospectives have sometimes wanted to preserve it as either. They remembered real warmth and real constraint, sitting together, inseparable. The same coffee morning that offered genuine companionship, also requiring a performance of cheerfulness that, looking back, they recognized as having cost them something real, some portion of honesty about their own lives that they had simply not been permitted to spend, week after week, year after year, until an entire decade had passed this way, performed rather than fully lived, even while it was, in its way, genuinely, complicatedly also lived. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we let this particular Sunday close, because I have been telling you all evening that a single wrong gesture could cost a woman her standing for years, and I think that claim deserves something more concrete than the abstract shape I have mostly given it so far. Let me walk you through a small catalogue of the specific, almost absurdly minor things that could in this world actually do that kind of damage, because I think the sheer specificity of it is more instructive than any general description could ever quite manage. The thank you note belongs near the top of this list, and it is worth understanding just how seriously this particular small piece of correspondence was actually taken. A guest who attended a dinner party, or even a more modest coffee morning, was expected to send a written note of thanks by mail within a window that the etiquette manuals specified with real precision, generally no longer than 2 or 3 days after the event itself. This was not, by 1954, treated as a charming but optional flourish. It was treated as close to obligatory as an unwritten social rule could be, and a hostess who received no note at all from a guest who had eaten her food and drunk her coffee and sat in her good chairs for an entire evening, registered that absence, kept a kind of private mental note of it, and factored it quietly into whether that particular guest received another invitation. Dorothy Draper herself wrote about the thank you note with an insistence that bordered on the moral, treating its absence as a genuine breach of basic decency rather than a minor lapse in correspondence, and a great many women of this period internalized that framing so thoroughly that the failure to write one produced real immediate guilt, a small persistent itch of having done something wrong that did not fully resolve until the note had actually been written and mailed. White gloves, which we discussed earlier tonight, carried their own specific minefield of potential missteps. The wrong gloves for the wrong occasion, cotton gloves worn to an event that called for something more formal, or gloves left on a moment too long during a handshake, or worse, gloves forgotten entirely and a bare hand extended where a gloved one was expected. Each carried its own small charge of visible impropriety that an observant room would register instantly, even while saying nothing about it directly. The correct removal of a glove for the specific act of eating mattered too. A glove kept on through an entire meal read as either confused or worse, deliberately careless about a rule everyone else in the room understood perfectly. Church attire carried its own catalogue of small potential disasters. A hat was, through most of this period and across most denominations, considered essential for a woman attending Sunday service, a holdover from older religious customs about head covering that had, by the 1950s, lost most of its explicit theological meaning for the average suburban Protestant congregation, while retaining its full social force as simple expected practice. A woman who arrived at church bareheaded, for whatever genuinely innocent reason, a hat forgotten in the rush of getting children dressed, drew glances, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of attention that followed her for the rest of that particular Sunday's steps conversation, whispered about gently, not unkindly exactly, but unmistakably noted. The dinner table held its own dense thicket of small rules, any one of which, broken visibly enough, could mark a woman as somehow not quite properly raised, whatever the actual truth of her upbringing happened to be. The correct fork for each course, working from the outside in as the meal progressed. The correct way to signal by the placement of one's knife and fork on the plate that a course had been finished rather than merely paused. The correct way to handle an awkward piece of food, a stray bone, a bit of gristle, removed from the mouth with practiced discretion rather than any visible grimace. A woman who fumbled visibly at any of this at her own dinner party or worse at someone else's, felt the small, sharp sting of having been seen failing at something every other woman at the table seemed to perform without any conscious effort at all, and she would very often replay that single fumbled moment for days afterward, certain that everyone present had noticed exactly what she herself could not stop noticing. Even something as simple as the proper way to answer a casual question about how she was doing carried real weight. The expected answer, regardless of the actual state of things, was some version of fine or wonderful or keeping busy, delivered with a light, easy smile. A woman who answered with anything more honest, who admitted even mildly to real tiredness or real worry or real difficulty, risked an immediate, subtle recalibration in how the asking woman regarded her, not necessarily unkind, but watchful now, slightly wary, the way you might regard anyone who has just demonstrated they are willing to say true things out loud in a setting that had not actually asked for them. What strikes me cataloguing all of this is how genuinely small each individual rule sounds on its own, and how entirely plausible it becomes once you have heard enough of them stacked together that an intelligent, careful, well-meaning woman brand new to a street like this one, could break 2 or 3 of them within her very first month without ever realizing she had done so, simply because nobody had handed her the actual list, because the list did not exist anywhere except in the accumulated, half-conscious memory of women who had themselves learnt it the same scattered, informal way, mistake by small mistake, correction by gentle, unspoken correction, until enough time had passed that the rules felt, to them, like simple common sense rather than what they actually were, which was an entirely invented, entirely local, entirely temporary code that an entire generation of American women built together in real time with no instruction manual beyond the ones they wrote for each other as they went. I mentioned a while back that she visits a beauty parlor every other week, and I do not want to let that detail pass without giving it the attention it deserves, because the beauty parlor occupied a genuinely unique position in this entire social landscape, different in kind from the coffee morning or the bridge table, and worth understanding on its own terms before we let this particular Sunday finally close. Unlike almost every other gathering we have discussed tonight, the beauty parlor was not a space a woman entered as a hostess, with all the careful, constant vigilance that role demanded. She entered it, instead, as something closer to a guest of an entirely different kind, seated in a chair, hair washed and set by someone else's hands, for once not performing the labor of care but simply receiving it, and a great many women of this period described this specific reversal, decades later in the interviews I mentioned earlier, as one of the genuine small pleasures of an otherwise relentlessly demanding week. The hum of the hairdryer hoods lined up in a row, each one enclosing a woman's head in its own small, warm, vaguely cocoon-like dome of white noise, created a strange and specific kind of privacy. A woman seated under one of these hoods could see her neighbors' mouths moving in conversation around her without actually hearing most of what was said, and this accidental acoustic isolation, oddly enough, sometimes produced more honest conversation than the careful, fully audible exchanges of a coffee morning, since a woman speaking just to the operator setting her hair, in the close, semi-private space beside the chair, while the dryers around her drowned out everything else, occasionally said things she would never have risked saying anywhere else on the social calendar. The beauty operator herself held a curious, almost privileged position in this world, neither fully inside the social hierarchy she served, nor entirely outside it, paid for her labor in a way that placed her by the strict economic logic of the period below the women she served, and yet trusted, in practice, with an intimacy and a candor that few others in these women's lives were ever offered. A good beauty operator knew, over years of regular appointments, an enormous amount about the private undercurrents running beneath a dozen different households on a dozen different streets, whose marriage seemed strained this month, whose finances seemed tighter than the family let on at church, whose child was struggling at school in ways the mother had not yet mentioned to a single neighbor. She kept this knowledge by the unspoken professional code of her own trade almost entirely to herself, and that discretion, that reliable professional confidentiality, made her, for a great many of these women, something closer to a confidant than almost anyone else available to them within the bounds of suburban respectability, closer in some ways than their own closest neighbors, who could never be fully trusted not to let some fragment of an honest confession slip, eventually, into the wider circulating current of neighborhood knowledge. She sits now, in memory, under one of those dryer hoods, on a Tuesday 2 weeks past, the appointment before this one, her magazine open on her lap to a page she was not really reading, the warm air humming steadily around her ears, and there is something in that specific memory, something close to genuine rest, that she will carry with her quietly into tonight's last few minutes before sleep, a reminder that even inside a week this carefully structured, this relentlessly observed, small pockets of real, unperformed peace still existed if a woman knew where on the calendar to find them. An unexpected, unannounced visitor created its own particular small crisis, different in kind from any of the planned gatherings we have spent the evening discussing, precisely because it offered no warning, no 30 minutes to tidy a front room or remove an apron at a leisurely pace. The correct response, drilled into a generation of women through exactly the etiquette manuals we have mentioned tonight, was to never, under any circumstances, turn a caller away or suggest the visit was poorly timed. However genuinely poorly timed it happened to be, a woman caught mid-task, flour on her hands, a child crying somewhere down the hall, was nonetheless expected to greet the unexpected guest with the same warm, unhurried welcome she would have offered a planned visitor, offering coffee even if the percolator needed to be started from scratch, apologizing lightly for any visible disorder while somehow managing to suggest that the disorder was minor and temporary, rather than the genuine scramble it usually was. This particular skill, the instant, seamless conversion of chaos into hospitality, performed convincingly enough that the guest never quite suspected the true state of things a moment earlier. Ranked, among the women who discussed such things honestly decades later, among the most genuinely demanding of all the small performances this era required of them. It is getting late now in this house on this particular Sunday evening in 1954, and I want to stay here with you a little while longer, slowly, because this is the part of the story that the magazines never bothered to print, the part where nothing especially eventful happens at all, where a woman simply finishes her day and goes to bed, the way millions of women on millions of streets just like this one did, night after night, across years that would eventually add up into an entire decade, and then into a life. The television in the front room clicks off eventually, the picture collapsing inward to a small bright dot before fading entirely, and the room goes quiet except for the particular settling sounds a house this new still makes after dark. A faint creak somewhere in the framing as the temperature drops a few degrees, the hum of the refrigerator cycling on and off in the kitchen, the distant, almost inaudible sound of a dog barking 2 or 3 streets over, carried on whatever breeze happens to be moving through the neighborhood tonight. Her husband stretches, folds the newspaper he was not really reading anymore, and says something about getting an early start tomorrow, a meeting downtown he wants to be properly rested for. And there is a particular tenderness in this small, unremarkable exchange that I think is worth noticing. Two people who have built an entire shared life together, moving through the last quiet minutes of an ordinary Sunday with the kind of easy, wordless coordination that only comes from real years spent beside one another, turning off lights, checking that the back door is properly latched, the small domestic choreography of closing up a house for the night, performed so many times by this point that neither of them needs to discuss who does which task. She moves through her own version of this closing ritual now, checking on her son first, easing his door open just enough to see the small shape of him under the blanket, one arm flung up over his head in the particular abandon that only small children seem able to achieve in sleep, his breathing slow and even and entirely untroubled by anything we have spent this evening discussing, by hierarchies of husbands' salaries, or the correct timing of a returned visit, or the particular social cost of a wrong comment about somebody's casserole. None of that has reached him yet. Not really, though it will, eventually, in its own way, the way every child eventually absorbs something of the world the adults around him have built. But tonight he simply sleeps, and she stands in the doorway for a moment longer than the task strictly requires, the way a mother often does, before easing the door gently closed again. In her own bedroom the nightly ritual begins, the one I mentioned earlier this evening, the rollers or pin curls that will keep her hair in its proper shape through the night, performed now in front of the dresser mirror with the small reading lamp throwing soft light across the room rather than the harsher overhead fixture. A final application of cold cream worked gently into her face, a habit recommended by nearly every beauty column of the period as essential to preserving a youthful complexion against the slow erosions of age. And there is something genuinely soothing in this particular sequence, performed identically nearly every night of her adult life. The cool cream against her skin, the careful arrangement of curlers, the small rituals of a body being readied not for any audience now, not for any coffee morning or dinner party, but simply for sleep, for the private, unwatched hours that belong, in this entire elaborately observed life, almost entirely to her. I find myself thinking, watching her move through this final hour of her day, about everything we have walked through together tonight, the streets that did not exist 5 years ago, The rules nobody wrote down but everyone somehow learned. The hierarchy built from husbands' salaries and expressed through nothing more than the warmth or coolness of a glance across a card table. The borrowed sugar and the returned pie dish. The gelatin salad set just right in its mold. The self-deprecating dance over a compliment about a roast that took 6 hours and considerable skill to prepare correctly. I think about Marjorie and the washing machine she should never have mentioned, drifting slowly toward the cooler edges of a community that never once said a single unkind word to her directly. I think about the telephone in the front hallway, and the careful etiquette of party lines, and the particular vigilance required to track a dozen households standing without ever once discussing money plainly. And I think, most of all, about this specific quality of tiredness she carries tonight, climbing finally into bed beside her husband, who has already drifted close to sleep himself, a tiredness that has no name in the language available to her, that the culture around her insists does not really exist, since by every external measure she has everything a woman in her position could reasonably hope to want. She does not stay awake long thinking about any of this, not in any sustained, deliberate way. The tiredness she carries is real enough that sleep comes, most nights, reasonably quickly, the accumulated physical and social labor of an entire week, finally permitted to simply rest. But there is, in the last few minutes before sleep actually arrives, a kind of loose drifting quality to her thoughts that I think belongs to every tired person in every era. The mind unspooling gently, touching lightly on tomorrow's tasks, a load of ironing still waiting from Monday's wash, a thank you note she owes the Hendersons for last night's dinner, the particular angle of afternoon light she noticed earlier today falling across her kitchen counter in a way that for just a moment made the whole ordinary scene look briefly, surprisingly beautiful, the kind of small private observation that belongs to nobody else, that no etiquette manual ever asked her to perform or suppress or calibrate for any audience at all. Outside, the street has gone fully dark now, porch lights switched off one by one as each house settles for the night, the curving roads that did not exist 5 years earlier curving away into a quiet broken only by the occasional passing car, headlights sweeping briefly across a bedroom ceiling and then gone. Tomorrow will bring its own version of everything we have discussed tonight. Another Monday, another wash day, another careful calibration of dress and tone and conversation, another week of coffee mornings and calling visits, and the steady, invisible work of simply belonging somewhere new. But that is tomorrow's labour, and tonight finally, in the dark, in a house still faintly smelling of dish soap and the last traces of a roast dinner from 2 nights past, she lets it go. The way you are letting go now too, the way this whole long story has been moving, slowly, gently, toward exactly this, toward rest, toward the particular peace that comes at the very end of a long day, when the rules can finally, blessedly be set down for a few hours, and a person can simply be a person, tired and warm and unobserved, drifting now towards sleep, the way I hope you are drifting too. If you are still here with me this far into the night, I am glad of it. There is something quietly remarkable about a whole decade of women building almost entirely from scratch an entire intricate social world out of nothing more than proximity and goodwill and inherited fragments of older customs, getting some of it beautifully right and some of it we can say now with the gentle clarity that distance allows, quite painfully wrong. They were not so different from us really, these women standing at their kitchen windows watching the street, worrying about a coffee call, wondering if they had said the wrong thing at dinner. They wanted, underneath all the specific rules of their particular moment, the same things people have always wanted: to belong somewhere, to be known a little, to matter to the people around them, and they built with the tools their era handed them, the best version of that they knew how to build. Imperfect, exhausting in ways nobody had yet found language for, and genuinely in its own complicated way alive. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. Whatever street you live on now, whatever rules, written or unwritten, you find yourself quietly following without ever having chosen them outright. I hope you can set a few of them down tonight too, Just for a few hours, the way she finally has, the way the whole street around her has. Every porch light dark now, every house quiet, an entire neighborhood of ordinary, complicated, tired, hopeful people, resting,